Ash drifted in the light like slow, lazy snow, and the red keep breathed smoke as if it had lungs. Ned Stark walked through the charred corridor with his cloak clenched at his throat, listening to the soft roll of cinders beneath his boots and the distant clatter of men at work unbarring doors they had once defended. Tapestries had blackened into hanging shadows. Brass sconces burned without their candles, heat still trapped in the metal, giving off a stubborn, reeking warmth. Through a broken lattice of carved stone, he could see the city below. Streets scraped raw, market stalls tipped on their sides, the glittering sprawl of the Blackwater where fire had floated earlier that morning and left a rim of oily color at the edges of each wave. A boy's toy lay between two scorched rushes in the passageway, a painted wooden dragon with the paint blistered. Ned bent to it and thumbed the peeling red from the carved eye, then set it back where he had found it, a soldier's superstition for not taking what was not his. The silence here was a different thing from the hush of Winterfell's godswood. It was the quiet after anger, like a room after a shout. He could taste iron. He could taste the day's decisions in his mouth, as if he might cough them out and make different ones. "Lord Stark," said a breath more than a voice. Varys stood nearly invisible in the smoke at the passage corner, hands folded together in that petal-soft way he had. His lavender-dyed silk was smeared with soot along one sleeve. A small thing, yet Varys's face held a precise sorrow that was not for his garment. He had eyes like shallow pools that did not show their depth until you sank. "You smell like a brazier," Ned said, because better to put something ordinary into the air between them than open questions. "Everything in this castle does." Varys drifted forward, careful to sidestep a fall of roof tiles, as if the stones might be offended by the press of his heel. The Lannister men were uncareful with what they set alight, and more uncareful yet with what they put to the sword. There were children. But you know this. Ned looked down the corridor to where the doors of the royal apartments loomed. Guards stood there already. His own men beside hard-eyed survivors of the city watch, the lion badge hastily torn from some sleeves and left hanging from others, not yet thought about. There were only so many thoughts men could hold at once after a sack. "I know," he said. "I have seen enough for one day." Varys's hands opened like a soft cluck of sympathy. "You have seen what will not leave you. I cannot give you different sights, only different words." He folded himself out of Ned's direct line to the doors and inclined his head. "The prince and princess have been found, Elia as well." Ned kept his face still with an effort he had practiced since boyhood. "Found where? Where they should have been. Not in life." Varys did not sigh. Even his compassion was without breath, a gesture drawn with a brush too fine to be seen. "The men who did what they did no longer look like men. That will comfort some who have never swung a sword, and none who have." "Names," Ned said, because names were a discipline and a consolation both. "Ser Amory Lorch seized the girl," Varys murmured, "and Ser Gregor Clegane the boy. Ser Amory's sword did the smaller kindness. There were sticky prints." Ned's jaw set as if to grind bone. "Does Robert know?" Varys measured him. "Not yet. His Grace is not yet king, but the city calls him that already, and the city expects him to smile on the lion that delivered him the gates. They have not felt a Baratheon's temper upon their skins, Lord Stark. We have. You have, perhaps. I have felt a friend's grief," Ned said. "And I have seen a friend's mercy when he thought no one looking." Memory gave him Robert with his hands full of mud from a roadside grave, cursing like a stable boy while he helped a farmer's sons lift their father onto a cart. The farmer had gone out to the fields in his best cloak to watch the rebels march by and not come back. "I do not know what he will be, now that we are here. Grief is a map with no roads drawn," Varys said lightly. "Men make their own paths across it. I would rather put lanterns in the hedges and see where they go." He glanced to the doors. "There are rooms his grace should not enter without being told what he will see." Ned nodded once. "I will tell him." He knew how Robert had spoken of Targaryens for years, as if the word were a bruise he could not keep from pressing to prove it still hurt. But this was butcher's work done in his name by men whose lord was riding up from the west with a smile and a promise cupped in both hands. The men at the royal doors lifted their spears for him. They stood aside as if relieved to let him pass and more relieved to remain without. Behind was a heat like a held breath. He stepped into the apartments and into the hush that follows violence. Not quite silence, but the small clicks and drips of a house remembering itself. Tapestries had charred into nightmares. The great bed where Elia had slept was half unmade. The coverlet peeled back as if a careless hand had meant to shake crumbs and instead loosened life. The floorboards were sticky, and the walls were sticky. The princess was already wrapped in a sheet, which only made her smaller. The servants who had found her had done it, the bent old seamstress weeping with the quietness of a pot left to boil itself dry. She had slid the sheet under with needle-prick hands and folded it over with a seamstress's care, a last hemming. The boy was not here. The boy had been found elsewhere, on the tiles near the small hearth where he had liked to play. Ned listened to his own heart beating. He had heard that same slow drum on the floor of the sept at Winterfell when the snow came thick at night. A beat that measured him, and the whole world, and all the cold years coming. He thought of Lyanna, who lay elsewhere and not in this city, who lay where he had only just left her, beneath a mountain of bones and white-blue winter air. The smell here was wrong for grief. It fattened itself on hot stone and meat sweetness. He looked at the empty cradle in the corner and the little carved horse with one will gone, and his hands wanted to break. His hands wanted to fold. In Winterfell, a man who rendered justice also raised the sword himself. He had never asked whether justice could be rendered upon a dead day long after the deed, or whether justice could be done to a dead child. If it could, whose hands would it demand? When he came out again, his men watched his face with searchers' eyes, and he gave them none of what they feared. He found Varys waiting where he had left him, as if the eunuch had stood without moving, like a well-mannered shadow. "His Grace?" Ned asked. "At the gates," Varys said, "coming up the hill with Jon Arryn and others. The Lannister host fills the streets to either side, like wolves trying to look like shepherd dogs." He paused, head tipped. "There will be gifts." Ned began to move. "Then we must show him first what cannot be made into a gift." They found Robert at the base of the Kingsway where the cobbles turned from street to steps and the steps to those last great risers that brought you to the gates of the keep. Robert's war cloak was thrown back, his black hair caught with iron hoops, his face red with heat. He had come up from the gatehouse laughing, and his laugh still bounced from the marble like thrown coins. Men loved to attach their joy to Robert. Even now his presence made space for relief in those around him, as if the battle itself had softened in his company. Jon Arryn rode just behind, grave and watchful. The rest were a knot of captains and friends and men who wished to be both. "Winterfell," Robert roared, catching Ned in his arms before Ned had the chance to bow. He smelled of sweat and horse and the sour of cheap wine forced on him by good-intentioned hands. "Gods, Ned, I thought you'd gone into the city by yourself to shame us all with your courage. Are there still walls standing? Or did the lions pull them down to build their own beds?" "There are walls," Ned said. His voice held him level. He tried to hold Robert level within it. "There are dead." Robert's expression flickered, a light wind moving in his eyes. "Aye, dead lions, dead dragons, dead rats in the cellars, if the gods are good. I'll drink to all of them. Where do you hide your wine in this place, Varys? Don't make that face. I know you put Vintner's sons in your sleeves instead of handkerchiefs." "I would not stain my sleeves so, your grace," Varys said and bowed. "Come see," Ned said to Robert, because the words needed saying before any others could make sense of what followed them, and because he knew his friend. Laughter first, sorrow second, rage third. He had to order them or they would order him. "Come see what men did in your name." Robert's face hardened a fraction. Jon Arryn's look was already iron. He had read something in Ned's tone that Robert had not yet let himself hear. "Go," Jon said quietly to the cluster of captains. "We will come up presently." Cloaks brushed stone. Men's eyes flicked from one face to another. Then they were moving, the three of them, and Varys as well, because Varys knew doors and when to open them and when to let them remain closed. They went up through heat and the stink of smoke and the iron taste that would not leave their tongues, into narrow passage and out to the rooms where the Targaryens had slept and dreamed and stepped from their sheets to their slippers of watered silk. Robert stood at the threshold like a man brought to a gamesman's board and asked for a move he had not thought of. He looked from the sheet-wrapped smallness on the bed to the corner where the little carved horse waited and to the hearth where the tiles had dried in a jagged, cracking pattern of pink and red. He moved to the bed with a carefulness that would have surprised all but those who had followed him longest, and laid his heavy hand on the sheet as if to find the heat of what it covered. He was breathing through his mouth. Varys's eyelids fluttered once, a stealth of sympathy. Ned said softly, "They were placed as a gift for you. Ser Gregor Clegane and Ser Amory Lorch did the deeds. Lord Tywin rides up from the west with his banners and a smile, and he will ask for your thanks. And he will bring you a lion's daughter in exchange for a crown. He will say that he gave you the city." Robert's big shoulders squared, as if his body had done what his mind was not yet ready to. His hand left the sheet and tightened into a fist. The memory of Rhaegar's breastplate under the warhammer must have been there. The noise of it, the black water spitting, and the crowd that had needed to shout because the prince's rubies had jumped into the river and men had leapt after them like frogs. "Where is that mountain with a sword for a brain?" he asked. He did not sound drunk now. He sounded like men sounded when they saw a foe they could strike, without the hind riddle of politics. "In the city," Varys said, sniffing out wine. His like prefers to celebrate. "I will find him," Robert said. "I will." He cut himself off. He did not look at Ned. "Tywin will bring me a lion's daughter," he said then, trying the words as if they were a key to something he was not certain ought to be opened. "And peace with Tywin is peace with a third of the realm and his bankers and his salt. He will bring me coin and connivance and call it duty." He breathed again, and the second breath grew teeth. "And he will bring me children's bones and call them loyalty." Somewhere in the keep a door went off its hinges with the crack of a tree splitting. Ned thought of the old gods watching him through leaves, and of one in particular, dull-eyed and tired of seeing blood, who still demanded the work be done. "We will meet him in the throne room," he said. "We will not meet him with smiles." Robert's mouth pulled back. The expression was very close to a smile, but not that. "No," he said. "No, we will not." Jaime Lannister was waiting when they came, white cloak brushed and spotless despite the city's filth, hair bright as new-minted coin. He sat casually in the seat of iron as if it had been thrown together to amuse him, like a boy's coach made of knives. His legs were flung out, and the easy set of his shoulders made men near him watch for the moment the ease would turn to violence. The Kingsguard sword at his hip flashed dully. Two white cloaks stood behind him, both older, both with the drained faces of men who had watched their vows catch fire and keep burning. "That seat is not yours," Robert said in a voice as big and heavy as the throne itself, and the courtesy in the saying of it was more dangerous than a shout. "Get off it." Jaime took his time. He swung his boots down to the step and stood, and for a beat of the heart his face was the face of a youth brought up short by his father's hand years ago. Then the Lannister charm slipped into place. "To be sure," he said, and held the look long enough to prove he had chosen to obey. "I kept it warm for you." His Grace Aerys had no further need of it. His eyes flicked, quick as blades, to the blood and char on Robert's boots. "You'll find the iron teeth bite through greaves and small clothes both. Sit carefully." Robert came forward 2 steps and then 2 more, and for a moment Ned thought he would give in to the old appetites and break a face at the wrong time. But Robert only leaned, his knuckles going white on the head of his hammer, and looked up into the iron seat as if looking into the maw of a beast he meant to own. He did not climb it. He turned instead, away from the throne, as if refusing a cup that would go to his head, and looked to the main doors. The doors opened like a staged miracle. The banners of Lannister gold and crimson unfurled themselves across the whole width of the hall. Tywin Lannister stepped across the threshold as if he had never learned to hurry, as if haste itself were a vulgarity. He wore no helm. His hair had gone silver, and the silver made his face more a coin than a man's. Stamped with implacable profile. Knights came behind and to either side, like punctuation marks in the line of his walk. Between them, brought as any household thing might be brought for admiration, were two small bundles wrapped in crimson velvet, tied with golden cords. Tywin stopped at the foot of the throne steps. The hall quieted around the sound of men's own pulses. Robert did not move to mount the iron. He waited at the base, and his refusal was its own coronation. "My lord of Casterly Rock," Jon Arryn said. He had stepped forward a pace, to put the words in correct order in the air and keep them from becoming quarrels. "You come late, but we have use for you still if you come to set the city in order." "I come when it profits the realm," Tywin said. His voice was unadorned, without interest in the trick of sounding humble. "I come with proof of my duty," he gestured. A knight set one of the velvet bundles on the step and drew the cord. A small face lay within, eyelashes dark against skin that had lost all its heat. The stitches at the throat were neat. Someone made a small animal noise. Ned did not know who. The sound was swallowed up by silence. He felt his hand go to the hilt of ice and then remember itself and leave. He looked to Robert. Robert stood as he had stood at the Trident when men gathered their fat breaths to cheer him. He did not look at the bundle. He was looking at Tywin Lannister, and his gaze was heavier than any helm. "Who ordered it?" he said. "His Grace Aerys was king," Tywin said. "He ordered a siege of his own city and the slaughter of his own subjects. He would have lit the city like a beacon if he had had the time. I spared you that." He nodded toward the small face as if it were a ledger entry. "I spared you a war that would not end with the prince groan, and the girl groan, and a martel snake at both ears whispering of sands and vengeance." "You ordered it," Robert said. It was not a question. It was the first law being spoken, the one that says that a man cannot put his name elsewhere when a thing is done by his will. Tywin's gaze slid as rarely as the iron must move upon its dais. He took in the hall. The blood, the banners, the watchfulness of men who knew their swords would mean more than any agreement signed later. "I ordered loyal men to do what the realm required," he said. "I did not choose to do it, as one prefers wine or a hunting dog. It is not a choice to take to bed and love. But the realm requires what it requires. You will be King Robert Baratheon because the city is yours and I brought you the keys, and this is what it means to accept a key, to take whatever is behind the door. If you will not take it, you are not a king who will keep his throne. If you do take it, you will have debts to those who did the taking. I am content to be owed." Ned looked to the small bundle again, and the varnish of Tywin's reason felt like a coating in his mouth. He could see that the stitches had been done by a hand who had done the work before. Jaime Lannister, off to one side, watched his father with a look Ned could not quite read. Not admiration, not fear. Jaime did not wear his disdain here, nor his boredom. He looked like a man trying to see what sort of thing his father truly was, and whether he could make himself into a different sort. Robert moved. He took one step forward, and then another, and the hall seemed to lean toward him to hear. "Lord Tywin," he said, and his voice rolled along the old stones with a slow, flat weight. "You say you came when the realm had need. You say you do not choose what you do, but obey what is required. If the realm requires justice for the murder of children, who will obey that? Will you?" Tywin did not blink. "Justice is what kings call it when they favor the realm. Treason is what they call it when they favor themselves. Call it justice if you like, but take the gifts that make you king." "The gifts," Robert said. His nostrils flared, and he laughed once in a soundless way that made men near him shift their feet. "You meant to buy me with murder." "I meant to buy the future," Tywin said. "Then you have bought it," Robert said, and lifted the warhammer from where it rested. The metal head looked dull and a little battered. He swung it easily to the crook of his elbow as if it were only play. "You are right that kings name things. They name the years and the victories and the debts. They give names to the children who live in their cities and the wines they drink and the swords they put in their friends' hands. They name their enemies when it is time to kill them. Do you know what I name you now, Lord Tywin Lannister?" Jon Arryn set his name into the space between, trying to reach him. Varys's hands pressed softly together in prayer or relief or calculation. Robert did not look to them. He looked to Tywin, and the iron he had refused to sit in radiated its heat at his back like a hearth. "I name you murderer," he said, "not of a king gone mad, though I have it in me to thank the world for that. Not of an enemy of mine in true-won battle. Of children, of a princess I knew as a name in a song and a boy I never saw laugh. I name you murderer, and I name you traitor to the simple thing that keeps men from being wolves. And I name you condemned." The word moved through the hall like a drop falling in a deep well. Men did not know whether to breathe. Tywin's face did not change. What moved was not the skin but something behind it, like a mask sliding over another mask. He stood as if he had found a way to let the words go past him, as he had always found a way to let all things go past him that were not useful to touch. "You will not say so when you have slept," he said. "You will not say so when you need my gold, and your good lords sigh and shake their heads and the small folk pull turnips from poor soil. You will not say so when the Greyjoys lift their heads, or the Dornish look to the deserts instead of to King's Landing. You will be a good king if you do not say so." Robert's smile, when it came, had a new thing in it Ned had not seen before. It was not the smile of a victor in a melee or a boy loosening his belt for a stolen feast. It was a tired man's smile at another man who has arranged the furniture of a room so that there is nowhere to sit without dishonor. "I will be a king," he said. "I will be one you did not make." "Guards," said Jon Arryn, but the men were already moving, because the old habit of obeying a voice like Robert's does not wait for the habit of obeying a crown to be made. Stark men stepped forward with the city watch, half a dozen in mail that showed patchwork and old care, 2 in leather-stained dark where the heat had bitten. Lannister men reached for hilts, but the white cloaks of the Kingsguard did not stir, and that stilled them more than any shouted command. Jaime watched, and his hand went not to his sword but to the edge of his cloak, as if to feel whether it still lay over him. "No," said Tywin, not loudly. He did not step back. "You do not understand your own necessities." But his lack of volume was not the lack of a man who knew he might be overruled. It was the lack of a man convinced that he would never need to raise his voice to be obeyed, and now discovered otherwise. Ned felt something ease in him, and something tighten. Robert took a long breath, let it out. "Put him under guard," Robert said. "Put them all who came in with blood on their hands. Ser Gregor, Ser Amory, find them. Find the ones who did the taking and the ones who gave the orders, and put them in irons. If any man refuses, he is a rebel, and you know what is done to rebels. I will do it with my own hands if I must." He lifted the hammer with a deliberation that showed how easily he might. Pycelle, who had lingered unnoticed like a piece of furniture one had expected to find, made a soft mooing noise about lawful process and the need for counsels. Jon Arryn's look cut him to silence. "They will say you begin your reign by pouring blood on the stones," Varys murmured after, when Tywin had been led away into a side chamber that men had used for justice 3 kings ago, the hinges long stiff and the iron bar across the door left to corrode. "They will say you begin in fear." Robert rubbed a hand across his mouth as if to wipe away the taste of something. "Let them say it," he said. "I have had their words on my shoulders for years. This is one I will choose the weight for." Ned felt the barest twitch in Varys's expression. He could not tell if it was approval or alarm or both at once. He did not care. He went with Robert and Jon into the inner room where law would be made into an act that could not be unmade. It was a chamber of old purposes. The bench was scarred where rings had scratched it, and the table was knife-scored and thick with the wax drippings of candles set down and forgotten. There were shackles set into the far wall, iron bits to keep men's hands from comfort. Tywin Lannister stood unbound with 2 guards at his shoulders who looked smaller for being so close to him. His very stillness took up room. "Lord Tywin," Jon said. His voice had the weary courtesy of a good teacher speaking to a pupil he must expel. "You are charged with ordering the murders of Princess Elia of Dorne, her daughter Rhaenys, and her son Aegon. and with leading men who have unlawfully sacked the city with atrocities beyond any rule of war. What can you say that we should not find you guilty? I can say that I saved the city from fire, Tywin said. I can say that I saved you a generation of rebellion. I can say that the Dornish will make peace with you because the matter is past and cannot be undone, and because I am a better friend of their pride than your pity would ever be. But it is wind. You have named me already, and you are a man who loves the sound of his own naming more than he loves food. I cannot speak against that. The only thing that could argue with it is time, and time is slow, and you are in a hurry. Jon's lips tightened. Robert's eyes had gone to a dull, dangerous place. If he struck now, he would do it without the cleansing of sharp words. Ned thought of the words one used in Winterfell. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. He thought of ice in his hands and of the warhammer in Robert's. Winterfell had never been in the business of kings, only of men. Say what you will for your soul, Jon said. We have said enough for the realm. Tywin's pale eyes slid to Ned as if measuring the weave of cloth, then back to Robert. I do not know whether I have a soul in the way you mean it, he said. I know that there is a thing that keeps meaning in me. It is not moved by pity. It is not moved by pride, not as some use the word. It is satisfied by the rightness of acts that keep a house standing. I did such acts. That is all. This will topple more than me. Robert hefted the hammer in his hands. You will have a clean blow, he said, because for all his fury and the sick smell of the chamber, he would not make himself a butcher for pleasure. You will have it from me. I will not let a headsman do this, or some boy I never met. Tywin's mouth twitched. It might have been a mockery of gratitude, or it might have been nothing. He lifted his head a fraction. They brought them into the yard because such things were not done within halls when men had the sky over them still to call a witness. The shadow of the tower fell like a pointing finger across the packed earth. Men gathered not as a crowd but as water gathers in a hollow. Slowly and without deciding, pulled by thirst and then by the thing that quenches it. There were faces Ned would remember and faces he would not. There was a little girl with greased braids and a chipped front tooth who stood behind a baker's wife and stared and did not understand. Not yet. There was a soldier with a missing ear who smiled without surprise. There was a septon who had put on his vestments wrong. The sash twisted. Robert took off his cloak. The sun showed him as he was, broad, the weight beginning at the belly and not yet heavy. A man not far past his prime and walking toward it with big steps. When he lifted the hammer, it made his chest look like a wall. He looked at Tywin the way a man looks at the tree he has decided to fell. He set his feet. By my hand, he said, for what was done in my name. He remembered to add the names, because for once names mattered even to him for more than the taste of their sound in his mouth. Elia of Dorne, Rhaenys, Aegon. Tywin did not kneel. There are men who kneel to admit a thing and men who kneel to deny a thing with courtesy. He was neither. He simply stood and, for a heartbeat, met Robert's eyes directly, giving and taking something that no one else there would ever know. Robert swung. The hammer came down with a sound that was not a sword's clean speech. It was the rending voice of bone and meat given up. Tywin Lannister crumpled in a way that seemed to collapse some architecture in the yard itself. Men flinched at the felt sense of it. The girl with the chipped tooth made a small disgruntled sound, as if a toy had broken in a way that could not be mended, and looked up at the sky to see if it had changed. Silence stayed and stayed. Then men remembered how to murmur and then how to breathe. The blood ran out and soaked into the yard the way water will find the low places. Ned looked at the iron head of the hammer and at the dark smear upon it and said nothing. There are things that later demand words. There are things that do not. When the body had been lifted and the yard raked to a roughness, when the onlookers had melted into the city like sugar into hot wine, Jon Arryn stood with his hand on Robert's shoulder until the knotted muscle under his palm loosened. We will have war for this, Jon said, low enough that only those who needed to could hear. We may have peace later, but first we will have war. We had war, Robert answered. His voice was huskier than the dust. I am only pointing where the old war lies under its rags, pretending to be something else. He wiped the hammer's face with a cloth that would never be clean again and gave it to a squire with a look that said the boy must either accept the burden or put down his service entirely. The boy took it and nodded, as if to say he had always expected to learn this part of the trade. Ned walked away to where the shadow of the tower ended and the sun lay warm on stone. In the warmth, the smell of smoke thinned, and the city beyond the keep made its low, ceaseless rustle, like a creek under ice. He leaned both hands on the parapet and looked down at King's Landing. It was an ugly city and a beautiful one, and it did not care for either name. Boats ticked in their moorings. The broken market stalls already had men riding them. There is a logic to repair that is older than much else. It gave him a small, stubborn hope, which is as much as any man is owed in a day. Jaime Lannister came to stand beside him later, as the sun slid toward afternoon and the shadows grew long-legged on the yard. Jaime's white cloak had taken on a faint cream from dust, and his hair had dulled with it too. He kept his hands folded behind his back. I took no pleasure in what he had done, he said without looking at Ned. If you hope to rob me of it. I do not go about robbing men of their pleasures, Ned said, or their grief. If grief it is. Jaime's mouth had the habit of a lilt, a curl at one edge that he could not quite smooth away. He has been removed. He made the word into a neat little package, as if he liked to wrap things in fine paper and set them on a high shelf. Do you think the rock will stand up and walk to the city? Or will it sit as it always has sat, and send men and writs at a measured pace? The rock will do what Casterly men teach it, Ned said, and Casterly men will do what the rock taught them. He looked at the young knight's profile. There were lines there that should not be in a young man's face yet. Is your loyalty to your house or to your vows? Jaime laughed once. Yes, he said, and perhaps neither. I swore to a king and I killed him. That makes my vows into a question you northerners would nail to a tree and then stare at for a winter while you decided whether to read it. I am not sure I can read it at all. He glanced at Ned now. His eyes were not mocking. Will you put me to the sword next, Lord Stark of Winterfell? I yanked a branch you would have left to grow until its roots cracked the foundations. Ned considered the young man's hand resting near his sword hilt without touching it. We are not done with you, he said, nor you with us. You are bound to the city by a white cloak, and to vengeance by your blood, and to your own judgment by the thing that lives between your ears. I dare say none of those will let you go. Ah, Jaime said lightly. To be needed by so many masters, it warms a man. He let out a breath. My sister is at the rock. She will not like what has happened. She may like what may be offered her, Ned said before he knew he would. He stopped himself then, because one cannot take back such a thought once it leaves the mouth. No, I do not think that bargain will be asked for or taken now. Jaime's eyes slid sideways, quick as a fish's. No, he said the word with a softness that made it not quite a negative. No, I think not. Elsewhere, in a different kind of light, Cersei Lannister stood by a window that had been made to show off a sea that few in her father's house looked at. The water lay distant, a patch of hammered blue framed by stone the color of old-baked bread. Her gown was thick green velvet, heavy with little gold bees sewn so fine they made their own small hives hum when she moved. She had not moved in some minutes. The raven had come with its legs trembling, as if even its bones had grown tired from beating against the air. Her brother Tyrion had read the letter aloud, because the words had come oddly to her eyes and made no sense, and she had wanted to hear them in another voice than the one she heard in her skull. Tyrion had a voice like a man who had learned to mock a thing and love it in the same sentence. He looked tired too. When he finished, he held the parchment out as if it smelled. She did not take it. Our father was a castle, she said finally. The words came as if she had dug them up, one by one, from a patch of ground no one had intended to plant. No, that is foolish. He was a wall. That is truer. Walls do not die. Only men do. What do you call it when a wall dies? A breach, Tyrion said. He had not come closer. He measured distance as other men measured gold. An opportunity, an invitation, a catastrophe. She turned on him then, and the gold bees on her bodice became the small bright eye glitter of a hive in sun.
Do you mean to jest?
I mean to count, Tyrion said. He took a step, then another. His legs had never quite decided to belong to him. He is dead. He was killed publicly by a man the city will call king tomorrow, if not today. Our brother wears white. The West will demand our blood's return. The East and the South will sniff the air. We have coin. We have men. We have... He waved a hand. We have you. Me. Cersei spat the word out like a seed she did not wish to waste in the compost. What do I have? You have a face men think they recognize from their stories, Tyrion said. You have a will like a boy who hated to lose at stones and kept playing until his fingers bled. You have a house that will look to you and your uncle and listen to whichever speaks louder and promises more of what our father promised and delivered. You have a brother in the White Sword Tower who can be made into a symbol, if not into a soldier we can use. Use him as a letter. We will write him into a banner. Cersei looked back to the small square of sea. It was so unnatural for a Lannister to have something that did not gleam. Uncle Kevin will speak of patience, she said. He will say that the rock must not shake itself apart with its own grief. He will say to send letters with silks and with iron folded inside them. He will say to remember that winter comes, and men will be poor and hungry, and coin will buy their knees. He will be right. She put her hand on the windowsill and felt the smoothness of stone polished by generations of sleeves and palms. And yet I want to shout. Shout, Tyrion said. We will tell the maester to take note. He is sure to have a ledger of them somewhere. She did not smile. She thought of her father's way of walking through a room. She thought of the day he had first spoken to her of kings and marriages, the way he had made them sound like chess when she had been a little girl who only wanted to tip the pieces and laugh when they scattered. She had learned to play with a cruelty he had called strength. He was dead now. She felt as if the air in the room had changed its height and she could not quite draw a full breath in it. Bring me the men who count the grain, she said. Bring me the men who count the swords. Bring me the men who count which of our bannermen would eat our hands if we stopped feeding them. We will count, as you say, and we will find the thing to do next that would please our father if he had a liking for the noise of applause from a pit of vipers. Tyrion bowed with a flourish that might have been mockery if not for the tiredness in his eyes. As you command, my sister. And the boy, Cersei said. Her voice grew softer by an inch. Jaime will be used against us. Find out whether he is prepared to be used by us instead. Tyrion spread his hands. He is prepared, he said, for something. He will decide what when he finds a mirror that tells him the truth. They do not keep many such mirrors in King's Landing. In Sunspear, heat made its own laws. It lay upon things as a monarch lies, with indolence and weight, and men made their peace with it or moved to other places. Doran Martell sat where he liked to sit, with his foot propped on a stool and a cushion tucked beneath his elbow. He turned the thin page of a book written in a script that had crossed the sea long ago and made a quiet home here. The raven had arrived an hour ago, and he had let it be fed and watered and set on its perch again while he finished 2 pages, then another 2. It is unkind to force words to stop, he thought. They are worse than a lame animal when halted without need. Oberyn Martell breezed into the room as if heat were nothing to him but another skin. He was all edges and glitter, sandals slapping, a copper bracelet bright on his wrist. He had not waited to be announced. He never did. Brother, he said without preamble. They killed him. Doran marked his place with a strip of woven silk and closed the book. They killed many, he said mildly. Which him, specifically, is on your tongue like a salted plum? Tywin Lannister. Oberyn smiled sharp. They broke him with a hammer. Baratheon's own fat arm. In the yard with the sky watching. It is like a song written by one of those northern bards who think a good story is an ox dragging a plow through the same field until the field learns manners. Doran's mouth softened, not quite a smile. You are cross with the North. I am delighted with the North. Oberyn said. He spun a small knife through his fingers. He had a talent for making play with danger look like a lover's trick. They watered him into the stones. They called the names that needed calling. There will be those who say it was too late and those who say it was too early. I am not one of them. I say it was exactly when I wanted it. Revenge is a spice, Doran said. It will flavor everything you eat if you keep it next to your bread. I like spice, Oberyn said. He leaned a hip against the sill where the shutters let the lavender air in. Elia's name was spoken, they say. Aegon's too. Rhaenys' name will be harder to catch in men's mouths. She always ran faster. He looked at his brother. Does this change your plans? Doran reached for the book and patted it as if it were an animal that might be soothed. Everything changes plans. The question is whether plans are the kind that can bend and not break. He lifted his hand. It was not as steady as it had been at 20, nor as unsteady as it would be at 60. We will not march. We will not send spears to King's Landing to ring the square and cheer as if a player had struck a good pose. We will send letters. We will send the quiet words that men ignore until they have nowhere else to go and then come to us with empty hands. Oberyn's mouth pursed. You will call it justice. I will call it prudence, Doran said. I will find if there is justice in it later. Justice often dresses as prudence when the day is hot. In the red keeps narrower bones. Varys made his rounds like a monk counting beads. He spoke softly to a washerwoman whose son had not come back from driving a cart of half-burnt chairs to the river. He spoke softly to a sellsword whose sword hand shook now that there were no charges to break. He listened to the way names moved through the keep and where they stopped. He listened to how the city said Tywin's name, some with relief, some with taste, some with surprise, all with the knowledge that a thing had been done that would ask them to do other things in the weeks to come. He stopped in Pycelle's chamber long enough to watch the old man fumble with a chest of remedies. Pycelle threw up his papery hands. Barbarism, he wheezed. Brutality. A king who begins so. A king who begins, Varys said. You speak as if the beginnings are negotiable. They are not. We have this beginning. He has named himself with it. It will echo for some time. He cocked his head. You will draft letters to Casterly Rock and to Old Town and to the Free Cities. They will ask how stable our weather is. You will tell them that the skies have cleared after a small necessary storm. You do not dictate to me, Pycelle blustered. No, Varys said and smiled small. Not aloud. I would never insult you that way. Robert dreamed that night of a tower room that smelled of blood and winter, and of Lyanna's voice which was like simple wind through dead leaves. No mystery, only the sound of something that has always been. He woke as if the bed had bucked under him. The dawn bled into the chamber, flat and inelegant, the color of old milk. He sat a while, his big hands hanging between his knees, and let the air pass through him back and forth until it brought him news of himself. His head hurt from lack of wine and from what he had done. The first pain he knew how to tend. The second would make itself his companion and his mocker. Ned came without being sent for, because that is what you do with friends who have done the thing they must do and must live in the day after. He sat without ceremony on the chair nearest and did not attempt words for the first few breaths. When he did speak, he said, We must find a way to put the city to rights. The small folk will not care for our names if the bread is not baked on time, and the Night's Watch writes letters that say they have not enough men, and Hoster Tully wants to send a singer with every message to remind us he owns rivers. Jon will help. He has hands for that kind of work. Robert let out a sound that might have been a laugh. Gods, and you call me cruel. You would set Jon to composing the feast while I lick the gravy from my thumb. Jon likes a feast done well, Ned said. A ghost of a smile visited his mouth and left. And the North will want to go home. I will want to go home, but we will not be able to. Not yet. I have men who have not seen their fields in 2 years if they left them to march with me. If they go home, the roads will fill with wolves. Then we will make a home here, Robert said, and the sentence was as much a surrender as a vow. For a time, he shifted, the furniture creaking under his weight. He looked at his hands. "I will not marry a lion." "No," Ned said. "You will not." "John will say a Tyrell," Robert mused. "Or a red wine. He will speak in parcels of grain and garlands, and he will be right because he is John. Hoster will propose a Tully cousin with hips like a mare and a dowry made of songs about rivers." He put one big hand to his forehead and rubbed where a headache had begun a siege. "I do not want any of them." "No," Ned said again in the same tone, which made it different. "You do not." Robert looked up at his friend, and for a heartbeat there was nothing in his eyes of king or hammer or any weight heavier than mud.
I am tired, Ned.
"I know," Ned said. "There will be a day for rest. It is not this day." "Gods, you do love that phrase," Robert said, a ghost of wickedness returning like an old stray cat. "If you were a woman, I'd have married you just to make you stop saying it." The jest died in his mouth. He looked at the window and the plain daylight beyond, and sighed. "Send John. We will make law of what we have done. We will send ravens with the words of it. We will offer a seat to the Martells at the council table. I will say that Eliah's name will not be forgotten while I am king." He scratched at his beard. "I will mean it. You may have to keep me to it when the wine comes." "I will," Ned said, as simply as if he had said, "I will wake with you in the mornings and bring you the cups with the handles you like best." "Find the mountain," Robert said after a space, his voice losing its softness. "Find him quickly. I want his head before the rock has time to decide whether it still has a neck." "We will try," Ned said. He did not offer more than that, because offering more can be a way of pledging what the world will not give you. They found Sir Amory first, because men like Sir Amory are always 2 streets from where you expect, having fallen into dice and a girl's lap and a rank puddle. The city watched with interest when he was dragged from a stew house by 2 Stark men and one of the watch who had chosen loyalty to whatever law could be made to stand. It took a day more to get him to the yard and have his truths from him. The truths came with bulges and knots and snot. He tried to throw names like knives and found they stuck in his own hide. When he died without making a story for it, and the city forgot him almost as they watched, because cities know what is worth keeping. Sir Gregor Clegane took longer. He was a mountain and moved like one, with long silences and sudden landslides. Stories of him moved as if they had legs. This morning he had been seen in a brothel with a laugh that broke the lamps. This midday he had been spotted in a bakery buying 10 loaves with coin that made the baker's hands shake. At dusk he had been seen leaving the city on the Rosby Road with a cloak that did not fit. Varys's little birds came to him with crumbs of truth, and Varys built a loaf. They sent riders too late and boys too fast, and by the time they had a shape of his path, he had shaken off the city's dust onto the country's, and the work of finding him would mean more than the work of one day. Robert's mouth tightened. He lived in an impatience that could drink and laugh and break chairs while it waited, but the waiting gnawed him still. In the White Sword Tower, Jaime Lannister read the book that held the names and lives of the Kingsguard, the white pages that men had added to like a church carving. He found old entries that praised better men, and recent ones that slackened into a sprawl of flatteries. He looked at his own page, which had an emptiness no flattery could fill. He could not bring himself to pick up the quill. What would he write? Killed Aerys II Targaryen because the king had decided to eat his own city and call it fasting? Saved men who would spit when they spoke his name? Watched his father die with his head broken like a hearth nut? There is no ink for that. He set the book down and looked at his hands. There was a nick on one knuckle from the day before when a piece of the Iron Throne had decided to take a tax from his skin. He wondered if men could chip themselves away with 1,000 such nicks until what remained was the shape of their oath without any flesh to warm it. Renly Baratheon came to the door shyly, a boy trying on a man's pace. He had grown taller since the last time Jaime had seen him. Grief and war have a way of stretching boys on some rack the gods keep under the world. "Sir," Renly said, and his voice had not yet settled itself into the depth it meant to have. "My brother says you will stay." "I will stay," Jaime said. "He does not trust me enough to let me leave, and he trusts my vow enough to know I cannot leave if he tells me to stay." Renly's smile was quick, looking for the place to land. He says you killed the king. Jaime held the boy's gaze. I did. He says that was a good thing done for a bad reason or a bad thing done for a good reason, and he cannot decide which is heavier farther from shore. Renly frowned, wrestling with the image he had made. I told him it does not matter because the king was mad and the city is still here. He told me that is the sort of thinking that makes men like you comfortable. I told him I like men like you, but not in the way you fear. He colored then, too fast for grace, and made a face that said he wished he were of an age when he could flee. Jaime found a corner of humor not yet bricked over. You will be a terror when you are old, Lord Renly. You will say all the things men are not supposed to say, and make them love you for it. He looked to the window. The day outside had gone smoother, as if the sun had put a cloth down over its glare. Tell your brother I will keep my cloak white. Tell him I will keep my sword at his command. Tell him I will see that the throne does not draw blood more than it must. Renly nodded hard once, as if to nail the words to his head, and went away. Jaime laughed again, and the sound had an odd softness in it. The city breathed in and out around the Red Keep, tried on its new voice and coughed. In the stews, a woman with a baby at her breast traded a ribbon for a heel of bread and called it luck. In a sept where the candles burned smoky from cheap tallow, a man prayed for the soul of Tywin Lannister because he had never known a world in which the Lion of the Rock did not exist and feared to live in one without him. On the Street of Steel, an apprentice hammered a bar of iron with more vigor than precision while his master watched and did not correct him, because the noise felt right to both of them. The river lapped. The bruised sky mended itself overhead. Messages went out with the evening. Jon Arryn's hand made them clean and precise and impossible to misunderstand even for those who tried. To Hoster Tully he wrote like a man writing to a dear cousin who must be told that the marriage cake would be late and the bride worse than imagined. To Mace Tyrell he wrote as one who sees a table and thinks of how many it can seat if the bench is moved. To the Eyrie he wrote to reassure men who like thin air and laws. To the Rock he wrote with a courtesy like the edge of a knife laid against the lip to take off the foam. To Sunspear he wrote, and there his hand slowed and grew gentler. He spoke Elia's name again, and said that a king had called it, and that men had died for it, and that her house might find in this the shape of an apology, if not the fullness of it. He sealed it with the stag and the falcon and the dire wolf pressed into the wax together as if making a new coin. The ravens beat the air like black hands. The men who set them flying watched their lines until they were swallowed by dusk. Felt like throwing stones into the sea. One does it because stones must be moved somehow. In Casterly Rock's deep rooms, Kevin Lannister read Jon Arryn's letter twice and then turned it to the light to look for the traces a man leaves when he is perhaps ashamed of his own words and has scratched something out. There were none. Kevin had never been his brother's equal in anything save staying. He had stayed in shadows and in councils alike, and made a habit of being a useful echo. Now there was no voice to echo. He lifted his head to find Cersei's gaze on him like a brand. "We muster," Kevin said, because if he hesitated she would speak and order the world in a way he could not later reframe. "We count. We send for those sworn. We do it with quiet, so that it is not taken for the roar of a wounded thing but for the exercise of a limb that must not atrophy." "And the boy," Cersei said. "Jaime is a hostage dressed as a knight," Kevin said. "We will speak as if he were a knight dressed as a hostage." He sighed and let himself be a little tired. "Child, I don't know whether to hate you or to go to my knees to you. Your father made you the perfect knife for soft throats. He is gone. Keep from cutting ours, and I will keep men from cutting yours." Cersei's green eyes did not soften. "Cut theirs first," she said, "and write a letter to Lord Tyrell. He likes his compliments piled high. Tell him he may have as many northern wolves for his jesters as he wishes if he laughs at the right parts." "Lady," Kevin said. He bowed. On the King's Road, a man in a patched cloak told another man that the wolf and the stag had made a meal of the lion in the city. The other man said that was a good jest and clapped him on the back so hard he nearly fell into a ditch. A third man listened and remembered that lions sometimes hunt in grass so high that you cannot see their tails. He walked a little more carefully after that, and looked behind him more, and this saved him from a rotten plank on a bridge that would have pitched him into a deep, cold ditch full of old iron. The night in the Red Keep came like a blanket damp from being hung too long in wet weather. Torches guttered. The voices of men softened and thinned. Ned lay on his back and stared at the ceiling beams. He imagined the old gods had no place here. He took one slow breath and offered it to them anyway. If they did not wish to come to the south, he did not blame them. It was not a place for old things, but if they came, he would welcome them. He thought of Winterfell's weirwood. He thought of a face graven in wood that had watched his father and his father's father and all their fathers before them sit with their backs straight and their hands steady as they did what needed doing. He did not want to be a king's hand. He wanted to be a man's friend. He was both now. He slept finally because the morning would require it, and sometimes that is a more powerful law than any writ. Robert went to the yard before dawn and swung the hammer at a post until a splinter leapt up and bit his forearm and drew a line of blood that looked clean and easy by comparison to yesterday's. He liked the thud that came back to his shoulder. He liked the way the breath moved in him when he worked. By the time the sun had lifted its head to look over the wall, he was sweating and tired in the good way that makes a man think he has outrun a thought. He had not. It waited. John Arryn brought him a list while he wiped himself down with a rough towel. Names lay on the parchment, neat as if the man who had copied them believed neatness could make them better. "Small council," John said. "We must at least pretend to start with the forms. We will need a master of coin, a master of ships, a master of laws. Varys will serve. He always serves." He made a face like a man forced to praise a meal he did not like. Pycelle will nod at the right times, and tally the leeches, and speak of the citadel as if it were a maiden to be courted. Robert's eyes moved across the names. He grunted and stabbed a finger at one. "This Peter Baelish. Littlefinger, they call him. Who is he?" "A minor lord with a major appetite," John said. "Catelyn Tully's particular story. Hoster gave him a small office once to keep him out from underfoot. He made it pay like a broodso. Clever, tricky. Not a man I would trust with my purse, which is why he will do very well with the realms." He rolled the parchment in his hand and then unrolled it again, as if the words were reluctant and he must coax them back. "You did a right thing yesterday, Robert. You did it at the wrong time in the right way. We will pay for it. I do not say we would not have paid for the other way also." "I will borrow the coin," Robert said and grinned sharp. "From Tywin, if he will lend to us from his grave." He clapped John on the shoulder. "Do not make that face. I know I am a fool. You will keep me from throwing down my crown to run after boars when the wine smells too good." He looked to the side, and the grin dropped away. "Gods, John, I am not sure I want this." "You will have it," John said, and there was kindness in the bluntness. "Better to want it less than too much." So the days took up their shapes and made new ones. The trial of Ser Amory was spoken of in 5 streets and forgotten in those that lay 2 hills away. The hunt for the mountain sent riders outward like a sunburst and then clawed them back with nothing more than rumors and a smell of crushed grass. The first petitioners came up the hill to the keep, carrying grievances like bundles, and found that justice had a face they had not expected. Heavy-browed, large-handed, with hair that needed cutting. Some went away pleased because the king had called a theft and not a mischance. Some went away displeased because the king had called their small property less important than their neighbors. All went away knowing that a man would be made to make a list and that lists at least meant someone had looked. Ned wrote to Winterfell and then wrote again, because the first letter had been all news and not enough of the things a husband says to a wife who waits under a cold sky with a house full of other waiting. He found himself writing of small things, of a boy he had seen in the yard with a wooden sword who had not yet learned to keep his chin down, of the way the bread here tasted of ash for a day and then the bakers remembered their tricks, of the way he had looked at the Iron Throne and thought of how badly it would sit in Winterfell's great hall, ugly among the wolf banners, ridiculous near the carved chairs with furs thrown over them. He told her the truth about Tywin, because he did not know how to keep it back, and also because he knew that Catelyn possessed a strong stomach for what was necessary, and a stronger one for what was honest. She wrote back with lines that steadied him. She spoke of Bran's giggle and Rob's scowl when he was made to read and Sansa's careful stitching that had finally taken to the cloth as if the thread loved it. She said the god's wood had flowered oddly, white petals falling like snow that did not melt for hours upon the water. She said the ravens kept coming like messengers who did not care whether anyone in the courtyard listened. In Sunspear, Oberyn spent an afternoon stabbing a melon with a thin knife in front of 3 spearmen until they laughed and begged him to stop. Doran read Jon's letter a 3rd time and then put it under a paperweight shaped like a lizard and wrote 1 letter only carefully, to the man who had not yet been crowned king. He wrote, "You called her name. I do not forget the difference that makes. We will see if time agrees with you." He sealed it with the sun and spear. He had the boy who had brought the first letter bring this one in turn, because he liked to be precise with exchanges. At Casterly Rock, Tyrion found himself walking often to the window where the sea showed itself like a reluctant servant and counting ships that were not there. He dreamed that a giant came to the foot of the rock and shook it, and that his father's voice, grown enormous, called up from the foundations asking who had dared to move the house he had built. Tyrion shouted back that no one moved the rock, that it moved or did not move entirely on its own, like a woman who refuses to pretend for her suitor's sake. He woke with the taste of lime in his mouth and laughed until the taste went. In the Red Keep, Varys sat with a child who had helped carry water during the worst of the fires and coaxed from her the news that a certain Sellsword captain had kept his men from raping because his mother's ghost watched him. Varys tucked the information away where he kept things that might later be useful for Mercy. It is a habit, he thought, that some men keep through pride to remember how to be decent. Others keep it through fear. I do not care why, so long as they keep it. Robert stood alone in the throne room one evening when the light falling through the high windows was the color of brass. He climbed the iron then for the first time because he was tired of refusing it. The seat took him like a thing that had been made for no one and would make no one fit. He shifted and shifted again, and the edges bit, and he cursed because he remembered Jaime's words and they were true. He looked out over the room and tried to see what kings see. He saw only a long floor that needed sweeping and a dais that would always be too high to speak kindly from. He put his hands on the arms of the throne and felt that they were cold. He thought of Lyanna again and thought of Elia, whom he had never known and whose name he had spoken in the yard to make a thing remain true after his voice had let it go. He thought that perhaps kings were made, in the end, not by iron chairs or by ceremonies, but by remembering names and calling them when the time came, and then doing what their calling required. Outside, the city had not yet learned to say his name the same way twice. It tried Baratheon and Barathon and Robert King and the new sharp coin of the one who killed the lion, and let all these sounds float up and sleep under the eaves at night, to be tested in the morning and kept or discarded by afternoon. That is how cities make stories, slowly and with a clumsy grace that becomes smooth only after the bodies have stopped twitching and the bread has been made on time for 1,000 days. When the first autumn rain came, it struck the blackened roofs with a sound like old parchment being crumpled. Men lifted their faces to it and let it wash the smoke from their hair. The blood stains in the yard turned thin and then thinner and went out into the earth in brown fans. This did not erase what had happened because nothing does. It only changed the smell of it. Ned went to the yard and stood in the rain with his hair stuck to his face and felt the chill go through him to his bones. He did not mind. He liked to be cold sometimes, a reminder that there were places where the blood ran slow and could not be hurried. He looked up at the wall and saw Jaime Lannister there, his white cloak darkening to the color of cream, his hair lank with water. They looked at each other like two men who had learned the same lesson in different schools and knew there would be a test none of their masters had prepared them for. Somewhere to the west, beyond the fields where the crowns of barley lifted like old men nodding, beyond the towns that kept their shutters shut a little longer than they used to, the Rock sat in the sea's jargon and thought about how to be a wall without the man who had been content to be mistaken for one. Somewhere to the south, a prince sharpened a spearhead and smiled in the direction of a city he had disliked since he first saw its towers painted very blue by the air. Somewhere to the north, a woman in Winterfell's gray halls read a letter and set it down and went to teach a daughter a new stitch, and told a son not to scowl at his books because there would be many years when his sword could not help him and he might have only words to keep him from falling into a pit. The rain slackened, The city steamed. In the throne room, the iron began very slowly to forget the last hand that had warmed it, and to get ready very slowly for the next. The iron seat of the throne cooled by degrees and remembered other winters, other hands, until it sat there as it had always sat, as if waiting were its only art. Dawn found the red keep damp along its ribs, ash pressed down by rain into gray paste that men tracked across flags and then wiped from their boots with strips of rag and handfuls of straw. The river stank with what it had carried away. The city's breath shortened and lengthened in the way of a man after a hard run, who looks for the second wind that will let him keep moving because life insists he must. Stannis Baratheon came up the hill from the gate ahead of a small file of Stormlanders whose cloaks had more patches than they had pride left, their faces skinned with hunger that had never entirely forgiven them for surviving. He rode straight-backed and grim-jawed, jaw so tight you could have struck sparks from his teeth. The siege had pared him to gristle. Even in the saddle, the austerity felt like another kind of armor strapped across a body that would not yield a single indulgence, not even to relief. The men about him called him Lord with a relief that sounded like stubborn piety, not joy. Renly came with him, a long-legged boy trying to remember not to bound down the steps two at a time in a place where men had been killed by dignity. He had grown again. Grief had put a finger on the top of his skull and pulled. His eyes were bright with news, and he carried it the way a dog carries a stick it wants someone to throw for the pleasure of running. They ate the leather, Renly told Ned in a courtyard where the rain had collected itself in the hollows and was warm under the first light. My brother would not eat the cat, but he told the men who did so that they had to do it in the shadow of the godswood and look at the carved faces while they chewed. He said it would keep them from lying about it later. He made a face at himself even as he said it, uncertain whether the boast sat well in his mouth. Ned looked past him to Stannis, who had reined in and looked out over the yard with a soldier's distrust of places he had not measured. "The siege taught you economy," Ned said when the elder brother dismounted and the brothers were together again, not touching because their bodies had not been taught any of the small courtesies that ease men who love each other. "I am sorry it taught you famine as well. It taught me that men who lay down their obligations do not deserve their ease," Stannis said. His voice flayed the words clean of ornament. "I held because it was mine to hold. I would have held longer if you had not come. I would have held until I had to gnaw the doorposts because that is what a man does when he has taken an oath. It is not a thing to praise. It is a thing to do. Praise is for singers." Renly looked down so they would not see him smile. Ned let the edge glance off. There was a comfort in Stannis' simplicity. It was a whetstone that never pretended to be anything else. "We came because it was time," he said. "We brought onions." "A smuggler brought onions," Stannis corrected. "You brought a banner and the smell of relief. The man who brought onions brought life. He will have punishment for it. He will have a knighthood. Both are his due." The corner of his mouth twitched in something that was not quite satisfaction. Perhaps it was a grim pleasure in the exactness of his sums. "I will see him before I see the king, so that I will say it right and not in the wrong order." Robert saw him regardless. He barreled into the yard with his hair uncombed and a grin thrown on his face like a banner. Too large, too bright, not stitched well along the edges. The grin faltered for a breath at the sight of Stannis, then found its place and held. They embraced with the stiffness of men whose shoulders have forgotten the way and remembered it at once. Robert thumped Stannis twice, then again harder, as if the act should make up for years of habits that had grown between them like a hedge without pruning. "You miserable bastard," Robert said fondly. "You held." "I held," Stannis said. "Someone told me you would let the cats eat you first," Robert said. "I said I didn't know you had that much mercy in you." He looked past to Renly and pinched his cheek with a big hand that made the boy yelp in indignation and delight both. "You grew like a weed while I wasn't looking. Stop that. I haven't the coin to buy you all new hose." Renly made an effort at solemnity that failed at the corners. "Your Grace, I will stop if you command it." "God save me from clever boys," Robert said, but the exasperation was feigned and warmed him. Then he stepped back and rubbed a hand over his face as if to smear away the greetings and get to the business that made his mouth taste of iron. "Come," he said to Stannis. "We will talk where men cannot call the words back by accident." They went into the small council chamber that had been stripped, cleaned, and left with the smell of lye and smoke. Jon Arryn was there already, as he always was, as if the habit of arriving first had become part of his structure. Varys had found a chair that put him a little in shadow and made it seem as if he were an ornament that had been fixed there long ago and only just noticed. Pycelle loomed and wheezed in a way that suggested a bellows with a leak. Littlefinger was not there. He had not yet been put where he would later stand with a smile like a knife slipping easily beneath a rib. Robert did not sit. He loved chairs too much to grant this one a victory. Stannis stood until Jon pointed at a place, and then took it with the military air of a man obeying position rather than comfort. "Dragonstone," Jon said without preamble. He had a way of stepping over pleasantries as if they were ordinary mud and not worth commenting on. The Queen was there. The Queen is there no longer, if the gods have made their decision. The reports are mixed. We have few ships because most were lost or sold, and what we have respect coin, and coin respects no one if it does not have to. We will need to take the island because as long as a Targaryen child lives under those black stones, men who prefer a daydream to the day will find a song to sing. "Stannis, master of ships," Robert said, cutting across the older man, impatient and affectionate both. "Lord of Dragonstone, take it from them. Hold it. Cut off their little hands if they reach for a rope to depart." He swung his big hand through air, the gesture a simple dismissal that had moved armies once and broken a prince open on a river. "I will give you cannon to fire at them if I can figure out what a cannon is. Give me words that sound like command and not like a meeting in a September." Stannis did not smile. "There will be wind," he said. "There will be sea. There will be men whose spines have learned to bend to storms. I have not yet learned the seas back. I will learn it now." He glanced at Jon, who had the grace to look only thoughtful. "I will need ships. We have not many. We can buy some. We can make some. Both will take time. They have the island and the walls and the water. I have the oath and your hammer," he acknowledged toward Robert, "which is only good for driving nails in this matter if you have rope to hold them and wood to nail. I will take what can be taken as quickly as it can be taken. If the Queen is dead, the boy will run. He will run to a place where men with soft hands make long promises. I will pursue him as long as the wind holds. I will hold Dragonstone when the wind does not." "Take the smugglers with you," Robert said. "They know the rocks. You can cut their fingers after if your teeth itch. I want that island so that I can drink without salt in my cup." Stannis's mouth turned down a fraction at that last. "I will take what is useful," he said. "I will throw away what is not. I will return when the place is held." "There is a man," Renly put in from the far end where he had tucked himself like a boy at the foot of a long table, trying to look older without entirely knowing how to carry the weight. Davos, with a face like someone carved it from driftwood and forgot to polish it. He brought the onions. "I know you will cut his fingers. I also know you will knight him because you are not unfair even when you are cruel. If you must cut, cut clean." "Do I take instruction from boys now?" Stannis said, and the dryness was a flavor he did not apply often. It made the room blink. "You take onions from smugglers," Renly said, recovered, wicked. "Instruction is lighter." Jon cleared his throat, which he did when he was about to yoke two stubborn animals to the same plow. "We will need coin to build anything at shipwrights, and coin to buy timber that is not wormed through, and coin to pay sailors who have learned the trick of desertion when their captain's purse lightens. We will need men who can count. I will send for Peter Baelish. Hoster Tully trusts him with sums and not with daughters. That suits the office better than the reverse." "Send for him," Robert said. "Tell him if he steals, I will break his fingers one by one and then put rings on them to remind him what it cost." His eye slid along the table and snagged on Pycelle's beard. "And you, old walrus, can you do anything but pant when the wind changes? Or will you kneel toward Old Town and wait for the Citadel to tell you which way to sneeze?" Pycelle clicked like an old saddle. Your Grace, I have served 3 kings. You have watched 3 kings die, Robert said, more kindly than his words. Practice serving one. Varys folded his hands, pale palms together. It would be a help to know whether Dragonstone still rocks a cradle, he murmured. There are mice in the walls there who once gossiped to me. The storm made them quiet. I will coax them to speak again. Meanwhile, the rock will wait, Robert said, and his face went iron. They will count. They will breathe. They will send letters as if they were swords. I will read them as if they were swords. If they kneel, I will let them keep their heads. If they do not, I will take their heads' opinions under advisement. He blew out a gust of breath and swiped a hand over his brow. Gods, Jon, this work leaves a man dry. Someone fetch me something that does not taste like the cook's bath water. Ned watched the lines that had set themselves at the corners of Robert's eyes since yesterday. He had expected this part to be easier for his friend because Robert was born to hit problems until they broke, and he laughed. But kingship was a problem that pushed back and did not crack. It gave, it offered, it yielded, and then appeared again in the next room wearing different clothes. He thought of Winterfell's old laws, and of the way a man with a spear stood at a door to count the people, not because counting them changed their hunger, but because it told him who would need bread when the oven was ready. Jon Arryn would count. It would never be enough, but it would help. Stannis left the chamber with Renly stepping quick to keep up. In the outer corridor, a man waited in a brown cloak that had belonged to a ship before it belonged to him. His face was knotted with sun. His eyes held the stubborn light of a man who has done something good he believes is slightly shameful. Stannis stopped before him without asking his name, because Stannis was not a man to pretend he needed to forget a thing in order to weigh it properly. You brought onions to my men, he said. And salt fish, he added grudgingly, because truth is a trick that must not be left without its smaller sibling. The man bobbed his head, not sure whether to bow or scrape or laugh. I am Lord Davos Seaworth of Flea Bottom first and then the seas. He looked toward Renly as if the boy might be less a blade. I had room in the hold. I had a wife who likes a husband who returns with both ears. I had a son who said to me, do not be a fool. I was a fool. I went anyway. Men were starving. You can punish me, I know. I came to take it standing and not run from it, because it does not taste worse than hunger. Renly's mouth shaped a soft O, as if the words had been a story told at a hearth. Stannis's face did not change. You broke the king's law, he said. You saved my men. The law is a thing that must be honored, or it is the same as wind. Mercy is a thing that must be weighed, or it is the same as water. I cannot have such water in my cistern. Put out your left hand. Renly made a strangled noise. Davos swallowed. He did not hesitate. He held out his hand. Stannis drew his short sword. Not the long one he wore for war, but the plain blade soldiers use when their work is close and unlovely. He took hold of Davos's wrist with professional care, the way a careful butcher takes hold of a joint to find where it will come cleanest away. He looked up once, brief, eyes flaring with a satisfaction that was not about pain but about order kept. You will be Sir Davos Seaworth, he said, and you will have fewer fingers to count your blessings with. He brought the blade down. Davos hissed, knees buckling. Renly turned away and then back, forced to watch because something in him needed to see that men did hard things and did not lie about them. Stannis passed the maimed hand to a guardsman who had already tied a clean linen with steady fingers. He had done this before in battle. He wiped his blade on his own sleeve and then pointed with it at the man who had just been punished. Kneel, he said. Davos knelt. Stannis touched the flat to his shoulder. Rise, he said. Serve. Do not smuggle for any man but me again. Davos's grin came crooked through pain. He gasped. It'll be honest smuggling from now on, my lord, my sir, my king's brother. Renly laughed wildly then, from too much blood in the head, and lay a hand for a moment, soft, on Davos's whole shoulder, as if to share a little steadiness by contact alone. Stannis watched them both, one corner of his mouth souring at his brother's softness, the other softening at Davos's foolish loyalty. He sheathed the short sword with a push that said that, for him, this was as settled as any sum. News ran ahead of Stannis to shipwright's yard. Old timbers were hauled out and hammered into shapes that knew the sea's language. Sailmakers set their needles moving with a spite born of watching good work burned for warmth in the siege and being told it had to be a comfort. Men who had once broken the king's levy to go out with smugglers were told they were pressed now into honor and into service. They chewed it like badly baked bread and swallowed because it was bread enough. Ravens winged outward in all directions, little black commas fixing themselves to lines of wind. To the west, one found its way to Casterly Rock through a sky that had turned the sea iron gray. Kevin Lannister took the messages with a care that implied nothing, read with the same care, and then set them, one by one, on a table that had belonged to his grandfather. The room around him had been built to make men feel shorter. He did not notice the trick anymore. Cersei stood with her hand on the carved lion's head of a chair and looked like a queen without a throne. She did not fidget. Tyrion sprawled on a lower bench as if defying the stone to put itself into his back. "They call it justice," Tyrion said after Kevin had read through the last of Jon Arryn's precise lines. "They call it a beginning. They do not say what it begins. I can think of several suggestions." "We do not name their acts for them," Cersei said. "We name ours. What we name will be believed if we do what our father did. Act in the world whose floor is made of coin, not songs." She looked to the window slot where a sheaf of light fell flat as a sword. "Uncle, the West will come when you summon. Some will come slowly to see what others do. Some will write to King's Landing and ask if they will be hated for coming here. Some will begin to count their neighbors' cattle and wonder how quickly the numbers could be changed. I want a letter to go out along the Gold Road. They will be told to come because we must celebrate a funeral and swear a new oath. They will be told that any horse that turns aside between here and the city will be noted. They will be told that anyone who does not come will be noted harder." "Lady," Kevin said, and in the one word there was neither rebuke nor obedience but an acceptance that suggested he knew, now, that his work had changed forever. "Ser Adam Marbrand rides from Ashmark. He is loyal. He is Dongay. Rouse. He is not a fool. We will tell him to come quickly and to keep his tongue, which may be harder for him." He paused. "We must answer the king's letter. We must," Cersei said. She was dressed in crimson dyed so deeply that when she moved it made shadows in the folds near to black. "We will call what he did an error made by a man who had lost a betrothed and found a city that had given him no welcome. We will call it the act of a man who has not yet had the benefit of counsel. We will say that Tywin was not only a lord but a structure, and that King Robert has knocked down a buttress in enthusiasm. We will offer ourselves as a scaffold to keep his wall from falling. We will send him a gift." "A gift," Tyrion said. He rolled onto his elbow. He liked the game he always had. Jaime's head? It would save the rock the cost of shaving it. Cersei did not look at him. "Jewels," she said. "Gold. Men. We will promise him ships if he wishes to build them. Not coin. Coin leaves the house and is never seen again, but ships return with good taste of trade. We will promise him servitors, men good at sums. We will promise him service. We will keep our promises. He will let us keep our heads because he wants to drink and fuck and hunt, and head-taking in the West will taste like old food quickly." "Careful," Tyrion murmured. "Sometimes old food surfaces at the wrong hour, all of its flavors coming back at once." "Then we will serve him something spiced," Cersei said. "He has always liked that." Kevin watched the play of words and saw the outline of action in it. It comforted him that there was still outline. He had feared a blur. "Lady," he said again, "I will have the scribes write." "Do it in my voice," Cersei said. "If he will not listen to the rock, he may listen to a woman he has not yet come to hate. Men sometimes do the first time." She touched the carved lion and then took her hand away, as if she had burned herself and could not admit it. At noon the next day, under a sky that burned its own haze away, A man rode in from Derry with a thin face and eyes that had seen the wrong kind of sky too long. He carried not a letter but a mouthful of poor news. Viserys Targaryen had been seen once, looking thin and furious and very small under a crown of pale hair, on a battlement at Dragonstone. Then the storm had come, the storm that would later lend a name to a girl who had not yet cried, and the gates had closed like a tale told in a room of men who do not want to listen. After, there were only whispers, then the sudden gaps that fall after whispers when men realize their voices carried farther than they meant. Varys held the man's shaking hand between his own and asked him about the taste of the air that day, the sound the waves made, the color of the torchlight. He did not ask directly whether the queen had labored and died. The man had not been near enough to know. And yet he knew, as men know when the central thing has happened and the rooms around it have changed their echo. Varys sent him away with a coin and a little cake and a softness between the shoulder blades that the man would not notice until he had slept. Stannis gathered ships in the bay like a man gathering flints, all sharp and ordinary and necessary. Davos stood at his shoulder and learned to say "I" without lying with it. Renly walked the quay with his hands behind his back and tried to talk to every man whose hands showed rope burn. He learned names with a facility he did not yet know was a kind of sword. He would cut with it later other kinds of knots. When the fleet was ready enough to be called such, Stannis gave his men a day to say their goodbyes to land. He used the day to work. Robert went to the wharves in the evening and stood watching the water slap wood and stone. He had kept himself from drinking. He had kept himself from the other thing. He had gotten used to the new habit of keeping himself and hated it. Ned came to stand with him. Long silence like a cloak laid over their two shoulders together. "We have not named my wife," Robert said, as if he were naming a horse he meant to purchase to plow a field and not break his neck on. "Jon will push a Tyrell. Poster will push his banner and call it a daughter. Mace will push his mother," he added with a short, ugly laugh that was not pleased but was honest. "She would make a better king than most men I have met and a worse wife than a barrel of nails." "You could wait," Ned said. The word "could" was not agreement, only whether. "You could not. The realm will judge you either way." "I do not want to be judged for my bed," Robert said. "I want to be judged for my hammer. The trouble is the hammer is no good for bedding unless you mean to break the bed." He scrubbed at his jaw. "There is a Florent girl. There are 100 girls. There is no girl who will wash this taste from my teeth. I had a girl. She is dead. The rest will be meat. I do not want meat. I want bread, and bread is dumb." He thrust the pain away with a growl. "And look at me, talking like a man the maesters move around with blankets. Give me a name that is not lion." "Wait," Ned said again. "Or make a betrothal that buys you bread later, when the girl is grown and you have learned to eat for necessity." Robert's laugh was less ugly this time. "Gods, you and Jon, the both of you, you would tie me to a child and tell me the rope will get thicker as the years do." He sighed, but some of the sharpness left his face. "Perhaps it is the best we can do. I cannot find it in me to marry today. Not after." He gestured toward the hill without looking. "What it would mean to the West. What it would mean to me." "Then do not," Ned said. "What would I do without you?" Robert said softly, not expecting or wanting an answer. Elsewhere in the keep, Barristan Selmy took off his armor and polished it with long, steady strokes until he could see his old face doubled back at him from the curve of the breastplate. Jaime Lannister came in without knocking, a courtesy that was an insult and a habit that was a plea. He stood with his hand on the doorframe and looked at the old man the way a boy looks at a sword master and tries to guess where the lesson will bite him. "I have killed a king," he said, "and I have watched my father die by the will of a man who is not yet crowned. I did not think to live to see both in one season." "Get used to it," Barristan said. His voice was duller than the steel he kept bright.
King Sti. Vater Sti.
Sons do not always know how to be either. Men like us, if we are lucky, live long enough to learn the wrong lessons slowly. He set the cuirass aside. "You did a thing that saved a city," he said. "I will not say it was a good thing or a bad thing. There are good men who say both. I will say I would have done it myself if I had known the wildfire would have been lit. I did not. I lay dying on the trident because I had given my strength to a prince who believed his father could be saved by the sight of his own blood on a river. There is no honor in ignorance. There is no dishonor in a sword struck true because the arm knew when to cut. Jaime looked at a point somewhere between the breastplate and the old man's white hair. Do you advise kneeling to the man who killed my father? I advise kneeling to the king, whoever he is, Barristan said. I have kneeled to worse men than Robert Baratheon. I have stood when better men than Tywin Lannister fell. If you kneel to the oath, kneel to it again. It is not a man. It is a thing. He wearily pulled the leather over one shoulder to see where had grooved it. And if you cannot kneel, leave the cloak folded on the chair. There is honor also in taking off a garment that you do not mean to soil. Jaime laughed without delight. If I laid the cloak down, men would applaud. They would say the Kingslayer had at last admitted his nature. And if I keep it on, they will whisper and snigger and call me an oathbreaker behind a lordly education of courtesy. I suppose in either case there will be sniggering. Get used to that too, Barristan said. Sniggering is a coin minted in all kingdoms. Is there anything to get used to that does not make a man worse? Jaime asked lightly, but his eyes were not light. Barristan set his hand briefly on the younger man's shoulder, a weight that felt like a benediction offered by someone who did not think himself a priest. The practice of keeping your sword where you have promised to keep it, he said. That does not make a man worse. Oberyn Martell came to King's Landing with a little embassy that wore orange and red like the sun had refused to leave them at night. He walked as if he owned every room he entered because he liked to pretend to own things until they became tiresome. The long road north had knocked some of the brightness from his sandals. He had not noticed. In the throne room, he bowed with a flourish that made men who did not like him tighten their lips and men who did like him widen their eyes. Your Grace, he said, you spoke my sister's name. I am come to see that those who made me want to say it in a killing way find their throats aware of the same syllables when they sleep. You have one of them. You killed the other. He smiled. I like a man who begins with an understanding of what is owed. Robert looked at the spear the Prince of Dorne had not brought and the smile he had brought instead. I killed the man who thought to buy me with what he had taken with a butcher's hand, he said. You wish me to kill the one who did the taking. So do I. He has run. He will be found. If I must, I will go find him myself and break him where he stands. But I am a king, and kings who go hunting beasts sometimes come back with teeth in their calves and laugh while they bleed. I would rather send men who can run faster. Oberyn's eyes glinted. Send me. Doran Martell's letter had been quiet as cool water. It had asked for a seat in council and the word justice written with a steady hand. It had thanked the king for speaking Elaya's name publicly and not making it a thing whispered in women's rooms. It had held back the offer Oberyn made now. But Oberyn was not a man who held back easily. Jon Arryn looked to Ned with a question that was also an answer. Ned looked to Robert. Robert's smile was a close brother to the grin that took him when he smelled boar and rain. Go then, he said. Go with 100 men who will not drink themselves under the table they will need to stand upon. Go with writs that say you hunt a criminal and not a knight, because I will not have some lordling say I sent a Dornishman to plunder his stables. Bring me the head. I will hang it somewhere it will see the sun for a long time. It will rot, Pycelle objected, offended by the thought of flesh forgetting itself where a man might see it. Then we will replace it with another and another until men learn the lesson, Robert said. If they are slow learners, I have time. Oberyn laughed. I like you, he announced, as if pronouncing a new law. Your way of speaking suits the weather. We travel, he told the men behind him, and turned on his heel with the grace that men with enemies practice in their spare hours. When the Dornish left, Varys leaned in and breathed a little. He will stir things, he said, things that might prefer to lie still. Sometimes stirring is necessary. Sometimes it is not. I will put my little ears to the ground and see which way they begin to crawl. Stir them, Robert said. We will find what is sleeping where we thought the ground was smooth. Beyond the city and beyond the land that had learned to speak in terms of which lord held which gate and where the better beer could be had. Beyond even the strait where the waters take on a different tone and tell a different story when a storm has passed, Dragonstone hunched into the sea wind and held its secrets under its scaly roofs. The birth had been long and the death quick. Rhaella Targaryen lay wrapped in a sheet that had been meant for a banner years ago and not used. A little girl lay near with hair the color of old snow and eyes that opened on the world and immediately seemed to look for a thing that had gone. Viserys clung to Ser Willem Darry's hand and tried to make his voice into command and found he had only a child's pitch. There were men on the island who would have sold them both to the highest bidder. There were men who would have cut their throats for the honor of it and hidden the swords afterward. There were men and women who had served a family too long to stop at a knight's word. When Stannis' sails showed like teeth on the horizon, the few loyalists who knew what sailing meant began to move the boy and the baby and the household that could be carried to a waiting cog that had been bought with a necklace and a lie. The storm had blown itself from the world and left behind a clear, cold breath. The oars bit. The cog moved like a heavy beetle climbing a slick stalk. The men on the walls watched. Some meant to give the signal. Some turned their faces away. The sea, for once, gave men back what they thought they had asked it for. Stannis took Dragonstone 2 days later. He walked the halls as if walking through the inside of a dragon's mouth and thought that men who lived here too long would forget what wood smelled like when it burned right. He did not look at the bed where the queen had died. He did not order any prayers said. He found the sept and nodded at it once, as if acknowledging a neighbor who keeps his own yard tidy and does not speak often. He took an inventory. He took a breath as if it would last and said to Davos, "We will strip this place of drunken men and keep the sober ones. We will keep the ones who fear me more than God. I will be lord here and master of ships there. I will serve." "You will," Davos said. He flexed the fingers that were left to him and thought of his boys at home and of his wife with her hair tied back with string in the kitchen and of the onion smell that had soaked the boards once and never left. He wondered whether he would live to smell it again and decided not to ask the question. Men make mistakes when they think they have to answer it. Back in the city, Littlefinger arrived with a smile already stitched to his face. He bowed deep to the hand and a little less deep to the king, as if measuring where the purse would hang and how easy it would be to cut the string if the owner dozed. He wore a mockingbird caught up in a pin of fine silver. He made 3 compliments as he approached the table and 2 jokes as he left it, and in between, when asked, he spoke sums with a clarity that made the dust of raw numbers taste almost like spiced wine. "We can lease docks," he said to Jon Arryn, and gave him a list of things that had never been considered property before and would be now because coin likes to recognize anything it can purchase. "We can increase the tolls on the Blackwater if we give the impression that men get something for them. We can build a road where there is none and say it is the king's road, and men will be pleased to pay the king for walking on it. We can. We cannot," Ned said. He had watched Peter Baelish making worlds with words before. He did not distrust the trick because of dislike alone. He distrusted it because sometimes the worlds lasted just long enough to fall into and break your ankle. "We can do the things that do not strip men of what little they have to eat. What men have to eat depends on whether the river carries grain cheaply or expensively," Littlefinger said with a shrug. "The weather and the price of timber in the riverlands, and whether the Lord of the Rock decides to strengthen his hold over the Mander by pretending to be interested in trees all matter. The king cannot command the weather. He can command roads and tariffs and whether a toll is paid in coin or in kind. If the men do not pay in coin because they have none, we will take the grain. If we take the grain and then sell it back to them at a price that will not make them riot, we will have both calm and coin. I confess I prefer coin to calm, but I am deeply moved by your commitment to the former." Jon moved his hand as if turning a page in conversation. "We will need a revenue stream that cannot be shut off when a lord turns his face away from the crown. Customs on the Blackwater can be stopped if the Arbor decides to prefer Oldtown, and Mace Tyrell sends a piece of sugared ginger to the Lyseni, and they decide that rowing an extra day is worth the flattery. We need something to stand that is not a favor. Then sell offices," Littlefinger said. "They will pretend to be shocked and greedy in the same breath. They always do. Men will pay to be what they already are if you tell them the king has seen them and written it down with a ribbon. Make a tariff on ribbon while you are about it." He smiled, delighted with himself, and let the smile be a weapon and not an apology. Robert listened, impatient and curious and disgusted and charmed in turns. "You may do your tricks," he said finally. "If I smell a trick played on me, I will flatten you like a louse under a thumb." He held the pinched forefinger in the air. "You may survive it. Some lice do." Littlefinger bowed again, as if men had not been threatened in the same breath as they had been hired. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "I am but a humble spiderweb. If the flies wish to throw themselves on me, it would be rude of me to refuse the gift." Varys smiled without showing his teeth. In Winterfell, Catelyn read Ned's letter and set it on the table where the light fell wide and clear. The children came in and out like weather. Robb, heavy with a boy's eagerness, bruised his knuckles with a wooden sword against a straw dummy that someone had given a ridiculous face. Sansa bent over her embroidery, tongue peeping out of the corner of her mouth in concentrated delight, and when she pricked her finger she sucked it without crying because she liked to demonstrate bravery when the stakes were manageable. Little Arya climbed something she had been told not to and then climbed down again with a harried apology that came too quickly to be sincere. Bran was still more dream than boy. He wanted to be everywhere at once and fussed when anyone made him stay in one place long enough to feel the floor under his feet. Catelyn watched them all with the steady patience of a woman who knows the value of each moment and understands that knowing cannot slow the moments at all. She wrote back to Ned without the weaving of fears into the lines. She wove them into the edges instead, where his eyes would not want to look. She wrote that the godswood had smelled strange after the last storm, but then righted itself, as the city would do, as men would do if they were allowed and made to by equal measure. She wrote that Luwin had shaken his head over a raven from Riverrun that had included 3 small flourishes that no practical man would waste time in writing when he had news to send, and she had loved her father for it. He had always had this useless habit. She wrote that she had taken to walking in the yards at night and counting the torches to be sure they still lit where they had always done. It reassured her in some small way that would have sounded foolish aloud. She did not write that at night. Sometimes, she woke to the particular quiet of a bed in which the man who should lie there had not died but had chosen an abstention nonetheless, and reached across to find the wall, not him, and pressed her palm to the stone because it stayed steady beneath her hand. A message went south from Old Town carried by a man who had been taught to walk as if he were. A piece on a board and not a man. The Citadel had opinions, and when the Citadel has opinions, it gives them to men who consider themselves instruments. The letter said that the appointment of a Grand Maester was a matter best left to those who understood what a Grand Maester was. It said that Pycelle was a pillar. It did not say that pillars sometimes rot from the ground up and collapse very satisfyingly at inconvenient hours. Jon Arryn tucked the letter in a drawer and did not answer for a week. When he did, he wrote a line that said, "We have had pillars enough. Send us a beam that can be moved if the wall needs to be altered." At the Golden Tooth, a pair of Lannister bannermen drank in a room with low beams and a good fire and talked about whether they should pretend to ride for King's Landing and then turn back halfway and claim their horses had gone lame from righteous purpose. One of them suggested that this would be a fine way to stay in beer and avoid the Eye of the Rock. The other reminded him that eyes are clever. They decided to go to Casterly Rock and be bored by Cersei's fury because boredom could be endured and decapitation could not. In Ashmark, Adam Marbrand threw a saddle over a fresh horse and felt the anger set into him like a new whetstone. He had admired Tywin not for his largeness but for his exactness. The way a thing placed will remain where set unless a stronger force moves it. He did not like a world in which things were moved by blows. Still, he was not a fool. He rode with speed and brought his smolder with him, banking it like a fire carried from camp to camp under pot lids and in cupped hands. In King's Landing, Littlefinger set men to collecting gate tolls with a smile and a slate. He made a point of standing with them in the rain once, as a demonstration of equality, and once in bright sun as proof of vigor. He knew exactly who noticed and exactly how to remark upon it without sounding like a man keeping ledger marks next to names. He put a boy with good handwriting and no family in charge of distributing the wax for seals. He had learned long ago that control of small things gives a man the habit of controlling larger ones. He could do sums and politics both with the same abacus. Gregor Clegane went back to his keep, not because he thought it would protect him, but because he did not think. He killed a man on the road for looking at him, and then another for not looking at him. He found a girl trying to pull a goat by the horns and twisted the goat's ear until it lay down from pain and the girl screamed. He laughed because it sounded like something breaking. He drank until sleep grabbed him. When Oberyn Martell came, he found the keep's gate half-hung, as if a giant had tugged it down in impatience. He found a woman with a blackened eye stirring a pot that smelled of old fat. He found 3 men who lifted swords and lowered them with the swiftness of good sense when they saw the way the Dornishmen stood. He found the kennel full and quiet. Gregor was not there. He had gone out with 2 men and a horse he could have sat upon from the age of 10 until now without the horse's back ever being free of him. Oberyn smiled. Hunts were their own kind of poetry. He had written some personally. He followed the mountain's trail into woods that had not asked to keep such a thing and were offended by it. Men came and went in the trees, and he showed them that a spear does not always require a shield to be well used. He killed one of Clegane's men with a cut to the hamstring that made the man fall with surprise in his mouth. He sent another away with a hand missing and a message in his ears to carry to the dog's master. He enjoyed himself because he was honest enough to admit when he did. He did not find the mountain in those first days, and he did not care. He had brought patience, folded carefully into his pack. Jaime received a letter that smelled of wax and sea salt and a particular scent that was neither. Something like the air of Casterly Rock itself, dragged across paper. He held it for 3 breaths without breaking the seal, and then broke it with a speed that suggested those breaths had been punishment. Cersei wrote like a general. She made her words march where she needed them. She told him he was a hostage and a tool and a hero and an ornament, and he could be all 4 if he used his pretty mouth as God and Father had intended, for smiling and for saying the right speeches. She asked him if he liked wearing white. She asked him if he liked the feel of a man's warhammer breaking their father's head. She asked him what he liked, and the last question was the only one that made him put the letter down and stare at the wall. He took his cloak down at sunset and shook it out and looked at it in the light that made the white seem not pure but the color of cream spiked with both honey and dust. He thought that he did not know whether he liked anything at all. He put the cloak back on the peg and went out to walk the wall and let the city's noises tell him what to feel. Robert held court for the first time with the heat out of the air and the flies slower. He sat the iron as a man sits a bad-tempered mule, by force of a hand and an attitude of mockery that fools the mule nothing at all. The first petitioner was a woman whose husband had died in the sack because he had been standing where a door fell. She had come to ask whether the king meant for his men to take her roof because she had no man to stand under it and say no. Robert listened and called to a guard to give the woman coin from the day's fines. The guard went red and hesitated and then did it. The second petitioner was a man who had been on the wall when the gates were opened and had run because he had feared the lion's men would cut him down for standing and the stag's men would cut him down for kneeling. He had been cut by neither and now wanted his post back. Robert listened and told him to go put his hand to a spear and see if it still knew the weight it had known. There were 20 petitions, and each one took more sweat from the king than a morning's hunt. When it was over, he drank a cup of small beer and looked at Ned as if to say, "This is the work then," and Ned looked back as if to say, "It is." Night thickened. The city began to glow in patches and then settle in others, as men decided that tomorrow would be the day they would begin their honest lives again and not today. In the Maester's Tower, Pycelle wrote a letter to Old Town that asked for sympathy without asking for instructions and then blew on the wax until it had set. In the rooms beyond the small council chamber, Peter Baelish shook hands with 3 different men who had believed themselves too clever to be bought for such small prices and discovered that they had been incorrect. Varys moved soft as a ghost and listened to a boy talk about where he liked to sleep in summer and a woman talk about where her cat had had its kittens. The stories braided themselves under his hands into something like a net. In the Red Keep's private chapel, Jon Arryn stood before a statue that did not resemble the father so much as it resembled the man who had carved it 40 years ago. Incisors too square, eyes a little lost. Jon's lips moved. He did not ask for much. He asked for enough clarity to keep Robert from making a ruin of himself. He asked for the strength to be disliked and not mind. He asked, briefly and without expecting an answer, for a son. This last was a habit and not a hope. At sunrise on the day they named without naming. The day that would one day be marked in ledgers as the first day of the reign of Robert Baratheon, though no song would remember the particular hour. The Septon spoke the words and the crown was set on the miserable mule. Robert bore it with a joke that made the hall laugh and a thinness to the humor that made some men look down. He had not drunk enough to forget. He had not drunk at all. The laughter came anyway, because laughter at a king is the easiest way to let him know you think him human, and the safest way to survive. The songs afterward were remarkably quick in their arrangement, as if the bards had been carrying them around in their sleeves and only needed the cue. Cersei's letter arrived 2 days later with a golden chain and a coffer that looked heavy enough to serve as a stool. The chain was fine work. The coffer held coin and jewels, and, beneath the jewels, a neat stack of ledgers that itemized obligations owed to the crown by men in the West who had neglected to pay for a year and then another. "A scaffold," Jon murmured, flipping a page and nodding despite himself. "They offer to hold up our wall. They will stand beneath it and count how far it is leaning," Ned said, dry. Robert took the chain and let it hang from his fist as if measuring its weight to throw. "We will take the coin. We will take the books. We will say that the West has bent its knee and not its neck. We will write that we are pleased. We will not be pleased. If they send a man with a clever tongue to stand in our council, we will listen and file his teeth down when he bites." He held the chain up. "And what do I do with this?" "Wear it when you wish to remind men that beauty can be heavy," Varys suggested. "Give it to Renly," Jon said. "He will wear it and make boys jealous and girls sigh and learn to enjoy both." "Give it to Stannis," Ned said, and Robert barked a laugh so large the rafters shook. "I'll give it to the gods," Robert said. "Let them wear it while they watch whatever farce it is we play out before them. No, give it to the Septon. Let him wear it until his neck aches." He tossed it lightly. Jon Arryn caught it without looking surprised. When Oberyn came back into the city, he brought 3 heads. None were the one he wanted. He presented them anyway. As a note in a longer piece of music one does not abandon merely because one cannot yet hear the chorus. "He has the trick of sliding," Oberyn said, not angry, simply entertained, which was more worrying. "He left a girl dead in a barn, her dress torn, her throat bruised. He left a man with his head caved in by a rock. He left a trail anyone could follow. I dislike men who think themselves clever because they do not know how to hide. He is not a fox. He is a hog. Hogs are killed in their sties." "Keep looking," Robert said. "Do not let the men grow bored and begin to take what they should not. Pay them better. Tell Littlefinger to make it appear from thin air. And if he cannot, I will make thin air with my fist." "Your Grace," Littlefinger said a day later, "thin air costs more than you think, but I have learned the trick of persuading it to pay its own way." He had built a raffle of sorts for the right to sell wine at the King's Gate. Men paid to enter. The winner paid to hold the right. The king's purse grew both ways, and the losers poured their beer respectfully in the knowledge that they would try again next month. "We shall have coin," he assured Jon Arryn. "We shall have resentment too. You must decide which you can afford more of." "We can afford neither," Jon said, but he did not tell Peter to stop. He knew a man with a basket when he saw him. The basket was already full of eggs. In the West, Kevin ordered banners unfurled and men drilled and food counted. Cersei stood beside him and practiced not being a girl anymore, which she had apparently finished. She had dispatched a softer letter to Old Town that told the Hightowers that the crown had misstepped and would need a hand on the stair. She had sent a private message to Paxter Redwine that suggested that his ships might find favor in King's Landing if his eyes found favor in the Rock. She made no mention of her brother beyond what was necessary to indicate he lived and wore white. She had the grace not to badmouth him, a lesson learned at her father's table. Never make your enemies look better by showing them they live rent-free in your mind. Tyrion visited the mines, as he often did when the world above felt like a stage with too many actors shouting their lines at once. He liked the smell of stone. He liked the way it told the truth about what it would and would not yield. He stood long in a tunnel lit by 2 lamps, looked at the glitter in the seams, and thought about the glitter of men's eyes when they see that they are not the only clever ones in the room. He chuckled, and a miner startled and nearly dropped his pick. Tyrion apologized and asked for a drink and was given a cup and a gruff nod. His jokes worked better in rooms with tapestries. He did not mind. He kept making them anyway. On Dragonstone, Stannis presided over a dining table that had seen kings eat and left no grease on the wood because its manners were better than those who had sat at it. He studied the books the old stewards had kept and the new ledgers Davos scrawled upon with his bent hand. He wrote to Robert not of storms and dragons, but of counts, ropes, barrels, spare spars, men. "We have not enough," he wrote. "We will have enough if we are strict." He did not say that he enjoyed the strictness the way other men enjoyed tarts. Stannis's pleasures were dry. He saw no reason to apologize for them. The girl child who had been born in the storm went over the sea. Willem Darry got them to Bravos with coins scraped from corners and a name given to a man who liked names. They found the house with the red door, or one like it well enough, and the boy who would be king when he grew held his sister with a grip too tight for her arm and told her stories of what he had been owed back in the place where their house had been cut from under them. The girl slept and did not hear. The free city took them and made them into a rumor men liked to turn their faces toward when the weather in Westeros turned sour. Ned went to the yard again in rain and again in sun and watched the men who would one day be told to stand behind the king while he took the air. He spoke to Ser Barristan and to the 2 other white cloaks who had remained, the ones who took their comfort in sameness and were therefore in the most danger now that things had changed. He walked along the wall in the late afternoon and saw Jaime there and nodded and did not speak, because sometimes nods do enough. He wrote to Catelyn with his left hand once, simply to see if the letters looked as if they had been written by a stranger. They did, and he laughed to himself and tore the page up, a silliness he would not make the ravens carry. Robert tried not to drink and succeeded for 3 days. Then he drank and was ashamed less by the drink than by his relief. He went up to the throne room and sat on the iron and let it bite him and thought that kingship was like wearing a hair shirt you hadn't chosen. If you took it off, men would say you were soft. If you kept it on, men would say you stank. He stayed until the light moved across the floor and felt the day pass in his bones in a way that felt almost like prayer. Autumn deepened. The smell of the river changed. The bakeries began to burn better wood. The first good pears appeared in the markets, and men ate them and found them slightly gritty and nodded anyway, satisfied with the grain in the flesh because it meant the season never lied. The oars on the Blackwater hit rhythm without thinking. The Red Keep looked less burn-scarred and more simply old. In the low September, a woman named Mara lit a candle for her husband who had not returned and did not say his name, because she had learned that speaking it made it hurt worse. In the Street of Steel, Tobomot took a boy on who had hands that fell in love with metal at the first touch. He let the boy practice on scraps and did not tell him that he would break something soon and cry about it in the alley, because Mott understood that some lessons must ride out of the forge on their own shoulders. The first snow dusted the mountains beyond the city and melted before noon. It made men in the yard look up, then shake their heads, then go back to what they were doing with a faint feeling of having been reminded that they lived in a place where winter was a rumor, not a rule. In Winterfell, the first real snow fell and did not leave. Catelyn turned up the fur at Arya's neck and told her to keep her hands out of her sleeves unless they were busy in a useful way. Arya made a face and then did it, which is the commonest victory available to any mother. From the Iron Islands, the smell of salt and rust and old, stubborn pride carried a rumor that a man named Balon Greyjoy wore his mouth like a closed fist and would not open it to praise a stag. Jon Arryn read the rumor and built a little plan from it, a thing that could be set aside until needed. From the Reach, Mace Tyrell wrote a letter that used the word friendship 6 times and the word supplies once, a ratio that pleased him and no one else. From the Eyrie, Lisa Tully wrote to her lord that she would marry him when he asked. If he asked, would he ask? Surely he would ask, and then cried afterward and did not know why. John read the letter and put it carefully aside and did not answer for a day. then 2, then wrote a courteous line that said yes, and found his hand shook afterward in a way that made him angry because he had thought himself past such tremors. In the rock, Cersei stood on a gallery that looked down over a foyer where once, when she had been small, she had slid down banisters and bruised her shins and been scolded by her nurse, and thought she might like to push someone from the balustrade and watch their body meet the floor 3 stories below. She did not. She smiled instead with her mouth and not her eyes and learned that this was a way of killing too. She wrote another letter to the king that included a suggestion for a marriage that could be delayed. A promise for when the child Marjorie was flowered. A tie to the reach that would bind the grain wagons to the crown's convenience. She did it because it was wise, not because it gave her pleasure, and discovered that wisdom without pleasure sits uneasily in the gut. Still, she sent it. She was her father's daughter. She would not pretend to be ruled by her heart. Robert read that letter with a snort that made the candle flicker. "A child," he said grimly. "Tie me to a hope and call it peace." Jon made polite noises. Ned said nothing. Varys made a notation in his softest book and thought about the way a child's name can become a banner if men hold it long enough. Littlefinger saw the words and thought of contracts and dowries and the way a promise 15 years in the making can be used to move coin for 14 of them. Stannis sent a note that said he had hanged 2 men for theft and promoted a third for the same offense because the third had stolen cleverly and returned what he had taken with interest, while the first 2 had done neither. He did not ask whether this was just. He assumed it was because it had satisfied his sense of proportion. Davos wrote a separate line to the king that said the men were not missed by anyone who would say so where others might hear. He added, "There is a smell to this place I have not yet grown used to. It is not fish. I know fish. It is the stone itself, as if dragons once pissed on it." Stannis did not see that line. Davos had kept it to himself and then forgotten he had ever considered sending it. Aelinor Hightower, who was not yet the woman she would become and this was not yet her story, kissed a boy under an orange tree in Old Town and decided, without telling herself so, that the boy's eyes were not clever enough. She made herself stop kissing him and went to speak to her father about ships. The father, who liked his daughters to visit with talk of trivialities, found himself surprised, said and pleased. He would later tell his wife that the girl had the scent of the rock about her, and it was not meant as a compliment, but sometimes compliments are accidents. Gregor Clegane wintered badly in a place that was not meant for wintering. He stole heat because he had never been taught to make it. He dreamed he was a boy and that the thing he had done to his brother long ago had been done to him instead. He woke with tears on his face and killed a man for seeing them and saying nothing. He tracked into the cold with blood cracking on his knuckles where the skin had gone dry and tight. He learned that the world is a wide place to hide in, and yet the men who want you can find you in it if they enjoy the hunt enough. He told himself he would cut the head off the next Dornishman who came. He did not. Oberyn sat by a fire one night with his cloak wrapped around his shoulders and a spear leaned against his knee and thought about all the things that can be sharpened. He smiled and thought perhaps he should return to Sunspear and let Doran do the next bit. He was bored and boredom made him mean. He spoke to his captain with the ease of a man who does not feel he must explain his mind to anyone. They turned their horses' heads. Oberyn would find the mountain later. He had a gift for later that not all men have. In King's Landing, the small council sat again to discuss the matter of coin and the matter of names and the matter of what one does with winter coming and the memory of blood not yet a memory. Peter Baelish proposed a loan from the Iron Bank with the blithe curiosity of a priest suggesting incense in a new color. Varys made a faint noise. Jon Arryn closed his eyes and counted to 8 in his head because 8 was the number that usually kept him from slapping a colleague. Ned said, "No, because some lines must be drawn early or they cannot be drawn at all." Robert nodded without much interest because loans were an abstraction and he had always preferred things he could hit. "Very well," Littlefinger said, as if they had all agreed with him. "We will borrow from the men who would lend to us and not call it debt. We will call it favors. Men like to be owed favors. It makes their wives look at them with a new set of eyes." His smile was indecent and charming both. He made promises to the king with one hand and wrote down lists of names with the other and told himself stories about how one day he would lift the whole world onto the edge of a pin and spin it a little. Varys watched and promised himself that, when the pin bent, he would be there with a cushion. And so the days came and were met and were put to bed. The west murmured but did not roar. The north muttered to itself like an old man and kept its own counsel. The vale smoothed its feathers and pretended to be content. The reach smiled and sent wine. Dorne sent spears that were used for parades and for other things. The Stormlands rebuilt both their walls and their tempers. Dragonstone learned the habit of order. The Iron Islands stared across the gray water and did their sums and miscounted on purpose, as they would later do properly. A girl with pale hair and bravos learned to say no and mine and see and door, and each word felt like a coin she was collecting for a purchase she could not yet imagine. Ned lay one night and could not sleep and got up and went to the window because a man looks at the dark sometimes to remind himself it is not as large as it feels. He saw the city laid out like a child's pattern of spilled grains, some places very bright, some places that had never known brightness. He thought that he had killed a man once in the rain, and now he had watched his friend kill a different kind of man in the sun, and in both cases the day had gone on afterward as if it had not noticed. He did not know whether this comforted him or made him cold. He thought of Winterfell and his wife and the slow trick of teaching boys to be men, a trick no one knows and everyone attempts. Robert dreamed of boars running into the sea and not drowning because their backs had turned to scales. He dreamed of Tywin's face at the moment the hammer came down and found that in the dream the face had not been Tywin's but Aerys's, because the mind sometimes makes economical use of props. He woke with a taste of ash and old blood and wanted to drink in a way he had taught himself to put aside. He did not. He got up and went to the yard and hit a post until the skin on his palms made a sound he did not like and did not stop. Stannis stared at a map and drew a line with a knuckle from Dragonstone to King's Landing and then to Storm's End, then to Driftmark, then back, a circuit like a rosary he did not know how to pray. He wrote to a woman named Celis at Brightwater Keep and told her she could visit Dragonstone when the wind shifted. He did not know whether he meant it. Davos told his wife in his head that the room was too cold where the Lord ate, but the stew was warm and better than onions when you had not had either. Cersei sat in her chamber with candles making puddles of wax like melted gold and counted men without moving her lips. Tyrion came in unannounced and told a joke that did not make her laugh, and then told another that nearly did, and then made a suggestion about moving levees along the Mander that she used later and did not thank him for. He did not mind. He had learned long ago that thanks are a luxury bought by men who have the leisure for them. Jaime dreamed he was a boy again and that someone had put a sword in his hand and then taken it away and told him to watch while they did the cutting for him. He woke angry and made himself go down to the yard and practice until Barristan nodded once and said, "That will do for today." And Jaime felt an obscure gratitude that had nothing to do with praise and everything to do with being told when to stop. He thought perhaps this was the thing vows do for a man when he wears them properly. They tell him when to stop. In the low parts of the city, a boy was born with a head of dark hair and lungs that were already loud. His mother looked at him and thought he had a blacksmith's hands. She hoped he'd have a merchant's wit instead and be kind to her when she was old. A baker's daughter married a dyer's son, and after the wedding went down to the river with him and put their feet in the water and promised each other to remember the day they had done something simple. An old woman who had moved through the sacks and the fires and the days that had followed them all took her last breath and did it so easily that the girl who sat by her bed thought she had been tricked by all the men who had made dying sound like a loud, complicated business. Winter had not yet come. It would. There would be years when the fields bristled with more bone than stalk. There would be men whose choices this week would make that winter harder. There would be men who would be good and fail anyway. There would be men who would be bad and thrive anyway. There would be a king who would be both, and be named for whichever he was being that day. There would be a girl across the sea who would grow and learn to love a word that had frightened her as a child. There would be a West that would remember the blow and pretend not to. There would be a spear. There would be a mountain. There would be a hand that wrote lists until his fingers cramped, and a friend who sat with a man who used to be only a friend and could not go back to it but could still come close. For now, the city slept and woke and slept again and was busy with the business of being a city. For now, the iron seat kept its secrets in its teeth and bled against whatever skin was rash enough to lounge in it. For now, The air smelled of rain on hot stone and the last of the smoke, and the sound at night was men's voices and the cluck of water in the gutters, and sometimes, rarely, a laugh that came by itself, not bought, not coaxed, simply there because men possess a stubbornness that is not always cruel. For now, the story held steady and did not gallop. For now, the world, Jared, found balance on a slightly different plank and rocked in place, getting ready for whatever gust would shove it next and ask it to call that shoving fate. The first frosts came like a rumor and left like a warning. Men put on an extra layer and told themselves that winter would not be as bad as the last one, and it often was worse. Still, the telling itself made them warmer. On an afternoon when the light had the thin look it takes after a week of clear days, Varys stood with his hands folded and listened to a Bravosi factor explain, over sugared almonds, that an old knight named Willem Derry had leased a house with a red door and paid for chickens as if they were nicked jewels. A soft man, the factor concluded, pleased with the picture he had painted for himself. He does not know prices. He pays for quiet. That is what the door buys him. Quiet, as if noise could be bribed. Varys smiled as if being told a joke that he did not mind having explained twice. He asked nothing about the children. He did not need to. The good thing about men who like to tell is that they do not notice what they are not asked. He left 2 more almonds on the plate when he rose. The factor stared at them as if they might be poison that turned itself sweet when you weren't looking. Varys went home the long way and spoke to a washerwoman, and to a page, and to a lad who had spent 2 hours pressed to a flaking wall, so he could hear 2 porters argue about whether King Robert's hammer had cracked a skull or broken the whole man like an egg. He tuned the city's sounds in his head until it hummed on a single note. It was a useful habit. It rarely made him happy. By the time the river had gone full brown and the last decent pears had been eaten, John Arryn stood before a septon and put his hand in Lisa Tully's with a pinch of wonder and duty both. The wedding was a small thing by the measure of men who like tables that sag under gold and lamb and the wine merchant's smirk. But small things can hold weight. Peter Baelish watched from a place where he could not be seen and told himself 3 stories at once, all of which ended with him rich and none of which ended with him happy. He smiled anyway and later made sure a little chest of soft fur arrived at Lisa's bedside because he had learned long ago that it is wise to send gifts that seem to remember a person's skin rather than their posture. Stannis Baratheon sent word to Brightwater that he would take Celis Florent to wife in the spring, because he believed marriages, other men's and his own, were to be made with the same exactness that he applied to inventories. The Florents were pleased and then pleased again when the hand's seal came on a separate letter that said it would be a good thing. They liked to be told twice. They liked to be told by different men. At Storm's End, the wind moaned around the round tower like an elderly dog trying to be let in, and Celis counted her gowns and thought about whether a husband's face mattered if his name sat correctly on the paper pinned to the wall. The wedding was held with the sea in the windows and the smell of salt pushing its way into the stew. Robert came and laughed and let himself be loved for the night. He drank enough to float a coracle. He told his brother that he would not be lewd at the feast and then was, because an oath made to his own mouth had never had the same gravity for him as one spoken before men. He left the hall with one of the bride's cousins, Delena, who had hair like honey in a jar when the sun gets into it, and a laugh that took any guilt a man might have had and put it to sleep with a hand on its head. Stannis found out. He did not shout. He did not sulk. He did not mock. He walked into a room without knocking and shut the door behind him and stood looking at his brother in the gray that comes to a stone room after the candles die, and he said, flat as a sum that balances, "You take and then give your leavings away like a lord throwing scraps to dogs. You shame my house when I am trying to hold it steady." Robert leaned back against the desk and looked as if he might laugh. He did not. "I do what I do," he said. "I don't pretend it's a virtue." "I don't ask you to pretend," Stannis said. "I ask you to stop." Robert did not stop. In time, a boy was born at Storm's End with black hair and a certain stubbornness to his baby mouth that made the women in the keep nod as if a story had landed in the exact shape they had expected. Celis lifted her chin and had a chapel candle lit. Stannis wrote to the hand and said the king's bastard was at his seat and would be well treated but not coddled. He did not write that the sight of the child made him feel both thwarted and absurdly tender in one breath, and that the two feelings had settled into him like oil and water in a bottle and would not mix. In King's Landing, a black-haired boy who would one day be called Gendry was wrapped and placed in a cradle next to a loom because there was no better place for him in a room that belonged to a mother who made her living with a needle. Later the boy would be handed on to Tobo Mott with an awkwardness and a relief that made the woman cry in a doorway where the wind found her collar and would not leave. Mott examined the child as he might have examined a bar of iron, rapped his knuckles lightly to feel the echo, and then nodded in satisfaction without knowing why. The boy slept. His mother went home with coin too heavy for her bodice and a piece of advice she would never be sure she believed: that sometimes giving away is the only way you get to keep anything. Varys watched these movements with a peculiar fondness he did not examine too closely. Men like Robert, he thought, move through the world leaving small versions of themselves planted like beans. Some sprout and grow and wrench a life around them into a different shape. Some are eaten by crows. He had learned to watch for the sprouting and feed it quietly when it suited the realm to have something sturdy in a place no lord would think to look. The West bruised and did not break. Kevin Lannister stood with a chart of banners and said which would be commanded and which courtesied, which coaxed and which held by the scruff like hungry cats. Adam Marbrand came and left with a look that said that loyalty and contempt can live peaceably under the same roof for a season if you keep them fed and do not let them chew on the same bone. Cersei wrote and told Paxter Redwine that his ships were a comfort to the eye even when they were far away, a line that made the Lord of the Arbor feel tall in his own hall. She wrote to Mace Tyrell that the Rock admired Highgarden's ability to make feasts out of thin soil, a line that made Mace beam and reach for another pastry. Olenna Tyrell read both letters and clicked her tongue and called her son an oaf and her granddaughter a darling and her steward a thief, which the steward was, and then set a runner with a note that said that if the king wished to tie himself to the reach for the sake of bread and sense, Highgarden would not be above the task of raising the rope and handing him the knot to pull. In Highgarden's sun-shadowed rooms, Marjorie swung her legs from a bench and asked her grandmother why a king would want to marry a girl he had never met, and Olenna told her that men like new tapestries because they have not yet learned where the moths have nested. Marjorie said that sounded unkind to tapestries. Olenna said it was and smiled, and put her fingers to a skein of wool and pulled until a knot shook loose with a sound like a small admission. The betrothal did not come at once. Robert wrote 2 words on a sheet, "Not now," and John Arryn sent a reply that was 6 sentences in the same sense. Cersei received that reply with a satisfaction that she did not share with anyone, and wrote a new letter to Oldtown that was almost sweet and said that the Hightowers would be wise to remind the king he could be king without being husband, a trick men forget when their courtiers remind them their beds are cold. The Hightowers wrote back with a polite line about Marjorie being a child. The line pleased Cersei more than any other that week. "It is a grand thing to have the world say what you want it to." Sandor Clegane came to King's Landing with a burnt face, a hungry horse, and a name that went in front of him like a bad smell. A name he had not asked for, and wore because men insisted names lay on men the way shirts do. He found a yard where men were breaking blades to prove they were strong enough to wield them, and showed them how to keep their wrists straight and their elbows soft, and then went to the keep because he had been told there were places in the city where a man like him could get work that did not require pretending to be a knight. He stood before Ned Stark and Jon Arryn both and stared at their hands until they lifted their gazes and saw him as if he had just arrived instead of standing in the room for 5 minutes. "You want to stand between a king and a blade," Ned said, as if reciting a line from a book he had read in a different life. "I want to stand between my meat and a thief," Sandor said. "That is what you make yourselves when you put gold on your head. I don't like thieves. I like honest killing fine. I don't like thieves." Ned considered him. Jon considered him longer because Jon believed a man tells you who he is when he is rude if you let him be rude long enough. "You will not call yourself a knight," Jon said at last. "I will not," Sandor said. "You will not take what is not given," Ned said. "I will not," Sandor said. "You will not drink to the point where your hands fail," Jon said. Sandor's mouth twitched. "Or at least," Jon allowed, "you will do it quietly and in the corner where no one can see your hands. You will say yes when we tell you to say yes and no when we tell you to say no, and keep your no sharp enough to cut what needs cutting." "I can say no," Sandor said, and the scar twisted when he smiled. Robert liked him immediately and called him dog with affection, which Sandor accepted because without affection it would have been a calculated insult, and with it the word felt almost clean. He stood behind the king at 3 hearings and said nothing, and at the 4th, when a man came up with a hand on a knife in his sleeve, he broke the man's wrist on the stone step with a small, careful movement that made the man gasp like a fish and confess to things he had not been asked about. Sandor slept that night in a bed for the first time in a month and dreamed of fire. He woke with his hand around his own throat and laughed while he let it go. Winter's edge came and went and came again, as it always does. Ned returned to Winterfell under a sky that gave him no quarter. He brought a child with him whose hair was black as wet bark and whose eyes knew nothing and saw everything. He showed the baby to his wife without a word, and the look in her eyes cut him without drawing blood, which is the worst way. He told her a lie that was close enough to a truth to wear its clothes. He told himself the same lie and let it live there because the promise he had made would allow nothing else. He walked the godswood and told the face in the tree that he would do the work. The tree told him nothing, which was a gift. Had it told him yes, he would have doubted it. He went south again when he was called, because kings do not like to eat bread alone. He kissed his wife's forehead without saying he was sorry. Sometimes a man's apology is a foolish thing to give a woman who does not owe him the relief, and Eld Rob in his hands and thought of hands and futures and the way both can be broken without meaning to. He put his mouth to the soft spot on the baby's head and smelled milk. He did not let himself think of any other baby, or any tower, or any word spoken in a room that smelled of blood and a sweetness he did not want for his nostrils ever again. The years came with the stubborn rhythm that tires men and saves them. Jon Arryn's hair went grayer. Robert's gut padded out under the shirts he liked best, and the laughter that came easier when he had a cup in him softened even on days when he had none. Littlefinger found ways to make coin sprout in any crack and invented new cracks when the old ones filled. Varys listened. Pycelle bumbled and did not entirely bumble, because any man who reaches a great age without leaving his chair has learned how to keep his balance when the floor buckles. Cersei at the Rock trained herself to take compliments from men she did not respect and to file them in a particular drawer in her mind where they might later be useful. Tyrion read. When the reading stopped giving him a taste in his mouth that felt like a meal, he went out into the night air and stood where no one would see him and let the cold write something on his face that no one had ever learned to read. Stannis and Sellis lived together at Dragonstone like 2 serious books put side by side on a shelf, neither softened by the other, but each looking better for the company. When Sellis fell with child, Stannis counted the weeks with his knuckles and did not say aloud that he wanted a son because he did not believe the gods were flattered by men who say their desires in the simplest words. He did not believe in flattery at all. He believed in fire built correctly and bread baked long enough. The child would come or not come. When she came, she was a girl with a curious eye and a mark on her face like the kiss of some creature the rest of the world did not admit existed. Sellis called her lovely and Stannis called her daughter, and then called for a healer who could not smooth the thing out and did not lie about it. They named her Shireen, and Davos, who had had boys until now, felt something take his heart and turn it, not roughly, not gently, just turn it, as if the organ had always been hung wrongly and was righted and could now beat with less complaint. The day the raven came from Pike, Jon Arryn was in the garden that clings to the keep's southern wall because that wall gets the light, and Jon had learned that a man in a city must trick himself into thinking he belongs in a place with growing things or his soul withers. He read the words Balon Greyjoy had sent around the world like a boy sending a message in a bottle down a river and imagined the man's mouth, tight as a purse string and twice as mean. He took the letters to Robert, who read the word king 3 times and smiled the 3rd because he knew his own face in the mirror of that word and did not like how the Ironborn wore it. Another king, Robert said, as if the first were not trouble enough. He grinned without amusement. We will knock his crown into the sea. The council nodded in varying measures of gloom and appetite. Varys suggested which houses would feel the sea's shudder first and which would use it as a reason not to come. Littlefinger had already written 3 notes that would make coin appear as if conjured from the wind. Ned came down from Winterfell with men whose hair had grown long and whose eyes had grown narrow because they had looked at snow too long and did not trust the way the south's light lies along stone. Stannis clenched his jaw until his molars sang and measured the wind. Barristan Selmy asked for a horse that did not shy from loud noises. Jaime Lannister asked whether the king wanted him at his side or his back. Robert considered a jest and then said simply, "My side," because for all that men muttered when they spoke Jaime's name, his sword was a thing a king liked near him when he meant to be where blows fell. The fleet gathered at Fair Isle because Stannis had decreed that would be where men remembered this hinge of the world turned, and his decrees had a way of becoming geography. The Iron Fleet came with its sails like skins and its decks slick with what the sea had spat on them for years without manners. Men said later that the battle was won by cunning or courage or coin or a fair wind. Davos said later that it had been won by timing and ropes and the learning of men who had come to the sea because land had given up on them. He did the work, which is to say he shouted until his throat bled and his hands bled, and he laughed in the middle of it because you sometimes do when you find that fear and joy occupy the same chair perfectly well if you sit them lower than your heart. When the Iron Fleet broke and the longships ran home like cats with their ears back, Stannis wrote a short line to the king and then tore it up and wrote a shorter line. Fair Isle held. I go on. Robert read it and clapped his hand on Ned's shoulder and said, "We go on too." And Ned nodded and did not say yes because there are times when a good friend's complete agreement rings hollow, and it is better to just move your feet. They laid siege to Pike under an iron sky. The wind trucked salt into everything, into the leather, into the bread, into the men. The Ironborn shouted from the walls and beat their shields and ran small boats out in the night to burn the besiegers' food and sometimes succeeded and sometimes drowned. Thuras of Myr came with his red robes and his wine sweat and set a sword aflame and made men shout because they needed something that looked like sorcery on a day that had too much ordinary misery in it. Jaime stood and watched Thuras and looked away because the sight made his gut clench with a taste that was not fear and not disgust but something that had both in it. Like a bad egg that a man eats anyway because it is what there is. The breach came where Robert had promised the stone it would. He put his hammer to the job the way a farmer puts his back to a stubborn stump, and when it came loose it took pieces of his hands with it and he did not mind. Barristan went in at his shoulder, the old grace all over him and no mercy in the arm that had learned its lessons too long ago to forget any now. Ned found himself in the press and left it with blood he could not swear had come from others alone. He carried on anyway because Winterfell had taught him to get to the day's end and count then, never in the middle. Jorah Mormont of Bear Island earned his knighthood on the sea stack they called the Bloody Keep, and the spray licked his beard and the blood ran down his wrist into his palm and made the sword hilt slick, and he held it still and pushed when his foot told him the rock had given him a purchase. Later he would tell a woman that the day had meant something. Later still he would tell himself that it had meant nothing. Both statements would be untrue. Thuras burned his robes climbing a ladder and laughed and drank and did it again and again until the ladder broke and men laughed with him because they could not think of what else to do with the sight of a man who had made his religion into a party trick and sold the trick to them at a price they could pay. Robert killed 2 Ironborn with a sweep that made men step back to avoid his anger and a third with a smaller, hateful stroke that made men stop and swallow because that sort of thing is less noble to see. He climbed, panting, and found Balon not in the place where stories say kings wait to be killed but up in a farther keep, watching from a window with a mouth that made decisions for him. The king of the Iron Islands valued his breath enough to keep it for later. Later would be very soon. The gates of Pike fell at last with the noise that very large things make when they admit to being only things. Men poured in, and what poured out was the sound men make when they are about to stop being. After, the passages held a stink that would live in would beyond 5 scrubbings. Robert walked through, hammer dragging now because even a strong arm has bones, and stopped before a boy with salt in his hair and a sick smirk on his small mouth, the brat of Pike who would have been another Balon if the world were less lucky and more cruel. The boy tried to spit. He had no water left in his mouth. Ned put a hand on Robert's forearm that said, "Not this," and Robert took his hand away from the hammer's neck and said, "Your father lives. You will not be king. You will live in a place where men know your name and do not love it. Be useful, and I will let you leave being a lesson to others." They took Theon Greyjoy south later. The boy looked back at his island, and if anyone had had the leisure to pity him, they might have used it there and then. No one did. Pity is a luxury in a room full of smoke. Balon bent his knee and spoke the words men speak after their houses have been walked through with iron feet. He spoke them without pleasure and without shame, and Robert accepted them with a grunt that did not hide that, for once, he had preferred the simple taste of victory to the necessity of continuing to be king. On the ride back to the ships, he sang a snatch of a song about a stag that runs and cannot be caught and laughed when it caught in his throat. Ned did not sing. He looked out over the gray water and thought about the kind of victories that are only pauses. After Pike, the realm moved as if a knot tied in its belly had loosened by a finger's width. Men in the west sent properly large casks to the Red Keep and smaller ones to their neighbors who had pretended that the king's rage had offended them more than the idea that it had been justified. Cersei wrote a letter that congratulated the king on his sensibly achieved pacification of the Isles. A phrase Robert read aloud with a parody of Olenna's dry delivery until he hiccuped. The letter also suggested that peace prefers to live in houses with two occupants, that is, a king and a queen. The line flicked at him and made him bare his teeth but not answer. Jon tucked the letter in its file. Varys made a sound like a cat who has just watched a bird not fly when it might have. Oberyn Martell met them on the King's Road, having turned his hunt inward to let the scent go stale and then freshen. He wore dust like jewelry. He kissed Ned on both cheeks with a humor that did not feel like mockery and said to Robert that he had killed 3 men who would have made the mountains heavier and none who made them lighter. "I will find your hog yet," he told the king, and Robert thumped him on the shoulder and said, "Do." And then, because talking about the mountain made blood taste like old coins, spoke instead about spears and girls, and Oberyn laughed and made the talk filthy enough that even the king glanced at Jon Arryn to see whether he was displeased. The hand only rubbed his eyebrow as if he had gotten some grit in it. When they came back to King's Landing, the city had turned its face to winter in earnest. The smell of smoke changed. Men were burning different wood. The gutters held. Bread was a touch scarcer and men were a touch patient because they had spent the year learning that there were larger hungers in the world than their own. Littlefinger had made a tax that was not called a tax and men were paying it because it made them feel clever when they found a way around it, which Littlefinger had put there for them on purpose. Varys had placed 2 girls in the kitchens who were good at slicing roots and slicing overheard words, and both talents were being used to the realm's advantage. Pycelle had grown a whisker that stood out from the rest of his beard and made him look like a broom that had seen too many hearths. He preened at it anyway. Barristan Selmy was tired and quiet and very kindly with boys who asked him to correct their stances. Jaime walked through the city as an ordinary man one evening with a cloak thrown over his white and his hair caught back, and listened to the way people said his name, and heard that they said it less. His father's had been louder once, and now it was a hush and a trouble and a coin that men looked at too hard. He sat in an alehouse and watched a woman's hands knead dough for a crustless pie and thought that if he had been born with a pair of hands like hers, he might have been a baker, and then he realized that his hands were those hands, built for the same patience, and laughed. The boy at the next table thought the laugh was about him and flushed and tried to straighten his shoulders. Jaime finished his ale and left because he had never yet learned to explain the difference between private and public pleasures to anyone, least of all himself. At the Rock, Cersei investigated treason and found only lazy men and frightened ones. She took their measure and demanded and rewarded with meticulous economy. Kevin did the counting. He discovered that the act of counting soothed him in a way he disliked, as if numbers were little prayers he did not quite believe in and said anyway in the hope that some god he did not admit existed would hear. Tyrion moved among the servants and the soldiers both, keeping the latter from bullying the former because he had learned in his own bones that small harms proliferate like mice if you leave them, and that they gnaw through important chords at the worst hour. He wrote a letter to Jaime that he did not send. In it he asked whether one could be noble in a house that had been uncrowned by a warhammer and whether the sound that lived in his ears at night, the sound of the blow, would ever go away. He sealed it and put it in a desk and told himself he would burn it when he was less drunk and then never burned it. Viserys Targaryen grew thin in bravos and meaner, the way men who suspect they will never be full sometimes grow. He taught the little girl words and then took them back again by ill use. She did not give them back. She hoarded them in her small mouth, and when he shoved she did not bite. But later she learned to hold the food with her tongue in such a way that it did not choke her when she tried to swallow against fear. Willem Darry died without spectacle. a thing that offended the boy and relieved all the servants who had loved the old knight for his softness and his good coin and had dreaded the day he would die and leave them with the boy and his coin alone. After, they had the boy and the girl and the coin for as long as it took the boy to fritter it into favors. Then they had the boy and the girl and no coin, and still, somehow, they did not sell the children to men who would have used them because they were weak-hearted, which is the kind of weak heart the world needs more of. Gendry grew enough to carry coal and learned to love the heat the way some boys love a river in summer. He worked when the work was too hard and slept like a boy who would crush foolishness out of himself by weight if he could. Mott taught him to listen to the note a blade sings when it is right and when it is not, a lesson that would be the only music the boy would want for years. Edric Storm grew with stories in his ears and salt in his nose and a nurse who told him that kings are just men you put too much of anything in. Too much food, too much wine, too much praise, and that sometimes the only thing to do with such men is take them out in the yard and let the winter wind humble them, and sometimes that doesn't work. Edric listened with grave attention and practiced bows in a polished chest and grinned at his own reflection. Jon Arryn's son came late and small and screaming. Jon kissed the top of the tiny head and went into the corridor and leaned his forehead to the cool stone and whispered, "Thank you." And then, because gratitude is not a permanent posture, straightened and asked the midwife 5 practical questions about Lisa's blood. The boy did not stop screaming for 3 months and then did not stop trembling for 3 years and then learned a way of being that kept him from shattering in a single day. He became cautious in his breathing, and that choice made his mother both proud and fretful in turns. Jon carried the boy often, like a man holding something he had always wanted and did not dare to grip too tightly for fear it would break. The mountain was not found. There were reports. There are always reports. He was seen in a brothel, punching a hole in a wall with a laugh like a cough. He was seen in a wood, walking under trees that seemed too small for him, as if some artist had drawn him the wrong scale. He was seen in the yard of a lordling who denied the sight and hid the blood on the straw by telling himself it had been there long before. Varys gathered the reports and laid them side by side and made a map of places a heavy man could move through without inconvenience and set men at the points where the map said a man will rest. Oberyn set off again with fewer men than he had taken before and a smile that worried those who were fond of him. He did not catch the mountain that month or the next. He caught other things. A fever. A line in his mind that would one day lead him to a different sort of arena. The knowledge that he enjoyed the hunt a little too much. Robert's rule found its shape the way an old cloak does. It settled on him, it pulled here and sat crooked there, and he wore it because it was the one he had. He broke chairs when the talk grew long. He let himself be bored and did not always punish others for his boredom. He lay with women who were not queens because there was no queen and told himself this was a mercy. When he woke and smelled himself, he sometimes thought it a cruelty. He loved his brothers in the way a big animal loves the smaller ones that sleep in its shadow. He sat in silence with Stannis once at Dragonstone and breathed, and the silence between them did not grow teeth, which was as much as either brother could ask of it. Ned moved between south and north and learned to move his face from one wind to the other without freezing in the middle. He hunted with Robert when it was necessary and never when it was not. He sat at Littlefinger's elbow and asked 3 questions that always made the little lord's smile widen. Who pays for this? Who profits? Who will be angry? He said those questions out loud once to Renly, who repeated them to himself at night like a prayer until he learned the better prayer he would say later, the one that begins, "Who loves me," and ends, "Who fears me." When the raven came from the wall saying that the winter would be long, Jon Arryn said, "Of course it will," and sent back blankets and a polite request for numbers. The next raven said, "Fewer than we need." The third said nothing. It died on the way, and a small boy found its little body in a ditch and took the ring from its leg and pretended he had been given a reward. Little boys like to pretend. Sometimes it turns into history. On a day when the air had gone very cold and the light very clear, Robert took Ned to the yard behind the armory and put the hammer in Ned's hands and said, "Feel it." And Ned did, and it was heavier than it looked. "The trouble with ruling," Robert said, not laughing, "is that you cannot always swing something until it breaks and then say the job is done. The trouble with not ruling is that you must watch while someone else swings and not always hit his hand when he swings badly. Do you know a way around this?" "No," Ned said. "We might look for one together," Robert took the hammer back and balanced it in his palm. "Feeling where the weight's Saturday we might," he said. In Casterly Rock's shadowed heart, a woman in crimson velvet stood before a map and put a finger on King's Landing and said, "I'll go," and her uncle said, "You cannot," and her brother said, "You should not," and she smiled and said, "Should and cannot are words I do not put much faith in," and began to pack. She did not go, not then, because 100 small things arranged themselves against the one large desire. She drank wine and tasted each sip as if it might be the one to make her forget the sound a hammer makes on a skull. She did not forget. It made her cleverer. It made her careful. It made her hungry in a way no food could mend. On a hill not very far from where the first red leaves had fallen that year, a septon with a squirrel's face told a little girl that kings are the servants of the people, and the girl laughed and asked him whether he had ever seen a servant wearing a ring that could buy a town. He looked down and realized she was right and told himself he would phrase it differently next time, and then forgot and told it the same way because it had been a comfort to say it that way for so long.
Men vrote, men rodde, men ruled.
Women did all these things as well, though fewer noticed. The Iron Throne bit. The small council talked until even Varys's eyelids lowered and Littlefinger began to doodle figures that were jokes no one else would ever understand. The realm held, as a man holds his breath, and then let it out slowly. Snow fell where it always falls. The sea made its slow, patient work at the edges of rock and land. Somewhere in a city of strangers, a little girl learned to walk with her feet quiet. Somewhere on a narrow island, a mother told a boy that he must not grow up like his father and knew that God laughs at mothers who say such things. Somewhere under a wall of blue ice, something listened and did not yet care. Ned sat alone one night with a list of names and sometimes made the sign of the old gods with his thumb upon his palm between the lines, a small, secret habit he had learned from a man who had kept secrets better than he had. He wrote to Winterfell love, and to Robert truth, and to Jon Arryn duty, and to himself silence. He could not keep all four. He would try to keep three. The candle guttered. He covered the flame with his hand and then took it away. The light steadied. He imagined that steadiness might be what lay at the center of this whole unruly world. Not righteousness, not power, not even love, but the small, stubborn practice of keeping one's hand where it must be over a simple flame so that others can read by it. He smiled a little at himself for thinking in such tidy pictures, blew out the candle before it could make smoke on the ceiling, and went to sleep with his sword within reach and his promise within his ribs. Heavy as always, familiar as always, never any lighter and never less necessary. The road back from Pike made a kind of dirt music under hoof and boot, a rub that found its rhythm at last when the last gull cry died behind them and the sea's damp gave the leather back to the oil. Men carried trophies in their stories rather than on their saddles. A ring prized from a captain's finger and tied inside a purse where no one would see carried less weight than a tale told around a small fire of how a ladder slipped and a hand did not. When they topped the last rise before the Rosby Road turned toward King's Landing, the city lay there with its smoke rising in thin gray skeins like wool teased out by a patient hand. It was an ugly, busy sight, and it was home to the kind of work that never ends. Petitions half-begged, contracts half-kept, bread half-risen. The boy they brought with them rode in a squire's place and scowled at the world as if it had made him a poor bargain and thought he was too young to know better. Ned looked at Theon Greyjoy and thought, not for the first time, that hostages often collar their captors as neatly as any chain. The boy made a jest at stark expense when a cartwheel stuck in the mud and then blushed and tried to grin his way out of it. Ned saw Robb in the tilt of that grin and winced at himself. He did not like seeing his own children anywhere but where they were. "Where will he go?" Robert asked, as if the question were casual, as if they both were not already looking north. The king's voice had been sanded down by battle. The hoarseness suited him, as old scars suit a favorite chair. "Home," Ned said, "to Winterfell. We'll make a wolf of him, or at least teach him not to bark at birds. Teach him to drink with his left hand and keep the right close to his knife," Robert said, and made a noise between amusement and fatigue. "You will make a man of him, Ned. The trouble with boys is that some of them notice." "You were a boy," Ned said. "I noticed," Robert said, and for once did not laugh. They crossed the city's skin like beggars who own it. Sandor Clegane took the fore with 3 men of the city watch flanking, their yellow cloaks dulled with salt and yews. Theon stared at the city the way boys stare at something they mean to conquer and then pretend they did not mean any such thing when it fails to fall down. Ned saw him shiver at a stink that came up from a drain and did not tell him the smell would become a background hum soon enough. The boy would learn the city's music on his own. Candlelight had begun to show in the windows of the Red Keep by the time they stabled and climbed. The keep did the thing it always did when Robert returned from war, large or small. It braced itself for noise and tried not to notice the ways the noise had changed. Robert thumped Barristan on the back with a fondness that did not feel like pity. He nodded to Jaime Lannister and did not say anything foolish. That restraint was the sort of courage kings get no credit for. That night, after the meat had been too salty and the wine not salty enough, Ned found himself on a parapet with the wind combing at his hair and the city laid out like a scatter of seeds on a rough board. Jaime came, not quietly, and leaned on the stone as if it had been built expressly for the angle of his elbow. His white cloak had taken a gray from travel, which suited him better than the starkness. He glanced sideways and smiled without showing teeth. "They say you brought the sea back on your boots," he said. "They say what pleases them," Ned said. He had learned to ignore the way Jaime's face made men think of coin. The young knight was handsome the way a river is smooth on a slow day. It did not mean you would not drown if you stepped in at the wrong place. Jaime tilted his head toward the inner yard, where a squire practiced falling with creditable gravity. "When I took my vows, they told me I would never take a wife, never hold lands, never father sons," he said. "They did not tell me that what I would mostly do is stand at a door and tell fools to turn around and come another day. You would think, with all the iron hanging behind us, the world would have more to say. You might consider listening when it does," Ned said, and Jaime laughed, not unkindly. Cersei Lannister came to court with winter in the sky. She did not march. She arrived in a measured procession that made the road take her shape rather than the other way around. Kevin rode at her right hand, a comfort masquerading as a shadow. Adam Marbrand and a half-score other Western lords chose their places behind and around as if arranging themselves on a board where the pieces have learned to move like their players. Tyrion Lannister rode in a covered litter for the first 4 miles and then disembarked and walked the last, because it amused him to discover that the city will bow to anybody if he behaves as if it ought to. Robert stood on the steps before the throne room door, not atop the dais. His hair had a curl to it that he did not always beat back with water anymore. He had fought on the wall, on the trident, on pike, and now he stood before a woman whose father he had killed, and he did not look away. Cersei came up the last 3 steps with a grace that did not need a herald. She wore Lannister red so deep it read as brown in certain lights. A small thing, but small things can be as sharp as needles. "Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy over much. She left space in the gesture for her own pride. "Lady Cersei," Robert said. He did not bend his head. He did not lift his hand. Sometimes stillness is the only language that does not lie. For a breath and a breath more the hall was held between them like a cloak stretched taut. Then it fell and the air came back into men's chests, and the particular noises of courtiers resumed. Cersei's eyes moved past Robert to the iron seat. Her mouth did not tighten. She did not look at Jaime where he stood to the side with Barristan like a pair of scabbards. "The rock sends obedience," she said, as if obedience were a delicacy wrapped and tied, fit for presentation. "We bring books that the rock has kept. Ledgers prefer to travel in winter. Heat makes their some sweat. We will read them," Jon Arryn said, stepping forward in the space propriety gave him, filling it without flourish. "The crown will answer debts the crown owes. The crown will remember favors. The crown will not recalibrate facts to please anyone's sorrow." Cersei's look said she had known precisely what answer would come. Tyrion leaned on a pillar and watched with a frankly curious eye, as if the business before him was a kind of theater he had not paid to enter but would happily watch until the end regardless. Kevin's chin dipped. He had approved this courtesied exchange at some table in the rock, perhaps in a room where a fire had been allowed to burn low because Cersei preferred a room to force guests to wrap their hands around warm cups. There are strategies that come from comfort. Later, in a room where the air had been made soft with tapestries and the smells kept themselves to resin and clean wine, Jaime and Cersei stood close enough to hear each other breathe. Her hand moved to his sleeve, smoothed the fold there as if the habit still carried the same excitement it had when they were children. Jaime did not move away. He did not move closer either, and she saw it and did not let herself show that she did. She had come to court with a plan to weigh the man who had killed her father and then find the line in him where a friend might rest his hand and a knife both. Jaime's nearness had always made plans into mist. "You grow pious," she said, to wound him in the one place she loved. "I grow," he said simply. His smile was easy. His eyes were not. "Barristan smiles upon you," she said. "You should be careful of old men who have never sinned. Their smiles are maps that lead you into deserts." "Barristan has sinned," Jaime said. "He has kept breathing while others did not. It is the worst sin those of us who survive must learn to live with." He leaned his shoulder on the mantel and stared into a fire that gave off more light than heat. "Are you here to beg for the West or to barter for it?" "Barter," she said. "Begging is for men who have not learned what it costs their faces." He laughed then, soft, because it was the sort of line that would have tasted good in their father's mouth. He did not say so. They did not speak of their father unless their words had grown flint and must be struck for sparks. Oberyn Martell returned to King's Landing long enough to have a bath that made half the attendants blush and the other half beam with professional pride. He carried with him a story about a half-seen shadow moving in a copse near Stony September, and a smell of old blood in a ruined tower south of the Trident, and a rumor so thin it could only be truth. Ser Gregor had been sheltered for a night by a petty lord whose name men had begun to say with care, and whose gate had opened with alacrity to a man whose visits did not return the next morning in one piece. "Do we pluck the lordling like a hen?" Robert wanted to know. "Later," Jon Arryn said. "Pull too soon and the yard scatters. Pull in court, and we catch more in the net." "Pull in court," Robert decided. He had learned to like the taste of that phrase when he could not have the taste of simpler justice. "Find the mountain before we pluck. I want his head on the hall's cold air while we ask questions with very kind voices." Oberyn's mouth curved. "As you like," he said. He did not ask for coin. He did not ask for men. He asked for a single writ sealing the king's justice to his pursuit. He rolled the wax in his fingers before it cooled, as if to feel the impression deepen under his skin. He found Gregor Clegane where rivers make men honest. A ford with flat stones slick with weed, water at the knee for a man of average height, halfway to the thigh for a giant. The mountain waited with the same purpose he had brought to every motion made by his vast body. Don't slip. Kill what notices if it does. Oberyn had spearmen hidden in brush and men with crossbows up the bank, and the kind of patient cruelty that makes a trap a piece of carpentry rather than a poem. They took him not with glory but with grit. Cord like a ship's hawser slammed across both shins and yanked, 6 men on each end. Bolts sunk in his thighs. A spear haft sacrificed to jam beneath his knee when he went down and twist that great hinge until it panged. The man they hauled from the ford bit a chunk from a soldier's cheek and took another man's thumb but did not rise again. They rolled him in chains like hogsheads, for rings cut for each limb, and yoked him to a wagon bed like a bull with a collar whose spikes were nails hammered backward through stout planks. Oberyn rode beside him and watched him breathe and did not speak his sister's name aloud. He saved it. He had learned patience. When they brought Gregor into the city, a hush went before the wagon like a breeze before rain. Men had said the mountain could not be caught. Men had said that if he were, no plank could bear him without breaking. Men had said many things. Men say different things when their eyes have been convinced. In the yard where Tywin had dropped, the spikes around Gregor's neck made a set of small, unspeakable declarations in the wash of light. The city was very quiet. Later it would roar. Robert came out with iron all around him, the throne behind, the guards to either side, Barristan 1 pace back on his right and Jaime 1 pace back on his left, the 2 white-cloaked men making a symmetry that pleased him on a purely animal level. Jon Arryn stood near enough to be heard and far enough not to eclipse. Oberyn sat his horse, still at the edge. like a man who has ridden long and prefers to keep a foot in a stirrup whenever possible. "Sir Gregor Clegane," Jon said. "The old laws love a neat line. You stand accused of rapes and murders done at and after the sack on the person of Princess Elia of Dorne and her children, and of further crimes under the king's peace. What do you say to these charges?" Gregor's head rolled to the side. His face had never been handsome. Now its bloat and the purple staining beds of flesh under his skin made it resemble bad meat wrapped in the suggestion of a man. His voice came out like iron-scraping marrow.
"No."
"You will have a trial," Robert said. He was looking at Oberyn now, not at the prisoner. "If you want one of our old ways, you may have it. You may name your champion. The king will name the crowns." A sound moved through the yard that was not quite surprise and not quite hunger. Trial by combat ended argument and began spectacle. Men like to watch a story told that way. Gregor's lips cracked as he smiled. "I will fight," he said. "Not fight," Jon corrected. His tone was not unkind. "There are forms." Gregor's eyes rolled. "I will smash whatever comes." "Then we understand one another," Robert said. He turned his head. "Who will speak for the crown?" Barristan stepped forward, as expected. Jaime moved a fraction and did not because he felt the pull and put his heel down on it. And then Oberyn turned his horse and brought it forward 1-2 paces, and half the yard breathed in sharply because they did not think it would be allowed. Robert's mouth did its small, private smile. He found himself pleased by men who did what he would have liked to do. "A Prince of Dorne," someone said under his breath. Shock and scandal both in the 3 words. "A subject of the king," Jon Arryn said louder, and that settled it. They kept 3 days to allow the man at the bottom of this old custom to get his parts in order. Grand Maester Pycelle harried and fretted in doorways about unguents and fevers. A Septon votive made a small speech about proxy sin. Oberyn took a spear and spent its afternoon cutting and rewrapping the haft so that it fed his hand as he liked it to. One night he sat with a cup and let the spear lie across his knees and told it 3 secrets in a language the spear could understand. Gregor slept and roared and woke and strained at his chains until they cut deeper and deeper grooves in the collar. Men had to take a rasp and file it from time to time so that it did not press too far into the swollen flesh and kill him before the show. On the morning the old law would be made current with blood. The yard wore frost like a veil that burned off slowly as watchers breathed on their hands. Gregor came led by 4 men with poles through the holes in his iron collar. He walked because he could not tolerate being dragged. He looked at the sky and saw the pale blur of a sun there and smiled as if he meant to eat it. Oberyn came with his cloak pinned in a lazy way that said he had dressed himself and not let someone do it for him as if he were under a mother's care. His spear point had been blackened with something that did not shine. He took no shield. Robert sat in the chair they brought for him at the edge of the yard with the arm that had swung the hammer across his lap and the hunger of a man watching a hunt he wishes he had joined. The first exchange was not an exchange. Gregor came on as he always had, downhill, as if everywhere were down from where he moved, and Oberyn let him come as far as he dared and then stuck the spear into ground and pivoted around it so that the man's momentum cost him more than the spear did. The second exchange was a test of footwork. Half the men in the yard would not notice that was what it had been. The third exchange, Oberyn made a feint to the shoulder and took the thigh with a neat sliding cut that made Gregor bellow as if insulted by his own blood. The fourth exchange took longer and made the yard crackle with attention. There is a kind of silence particular to men who think they are watching something become inevitable. If Oberyn had spoken Eliah's name aloud, he might have lost, because that kind of naming sometimes turns the world to syrup. He kept the breath inside. He moved as if the ground were flatter than it was, as if the air were richer, as if his staff were a third leg that belonged to him as naturally as a limb, as if the spear point had eyes. He had poisoned it. It did not matter. The poison would work if the cut came. The cut came. He did not stand at a safe remove and demand a confession he had never intended to accept. He got inside the arms and the shoulder that wanted to grab and crush, and he drove the spear not into a belly that might yield or a shoulder shielded by light mail, but up under the jaw, through the mouth where a tongue began, and out under the hinge of the ear. The spear stuck there, making Gregor's head a grotesque banner. The big man stumbled and made two enormous, bewildered noises and then fell like the last piece of a ruined wall. A long, quiet sound left the yard, like breath moving through reeds. Oberyn stood over him for a beat, hand on the haft as if feeling the big animal's last thrumming. He left the weapon there for the men to deal with. Sometimes it is kind to let wood and iron keep their trophies. He went to one knee anyway because his body had demanded it, his blood celebrating with a sudden willingness to leave him. He rested his hand on the ground and breathed until the world steadied. His head rose and turned toward the dais. He did not smile because sometimes victory looks best in a sober face. "Justice," Robert said into the air. Men heard it and let themselves dole out the measure of satisfaction their inclinations allowed. Varys lowered his eyes and thought about how hope and revenge make poor soup, but men keep ordering it. Jon Arryn nodded once, which for him was emotion. Pycelle flapped and worried about splinters of bone lodged in the wound. Was it necessary to pull the spear free? And whether the crowd would disperse in an orderly fashion. The city cheered after its fashion, and in many corners when the tale was told that night the most important detail would be the blood, and how much and who had stood nearest it and not flinched. A raven flew the south road to Sunspear with a letter that had Elijah's name in it and the words King's Justice. Doran Martell read it with his fingers and with his eyes. The first seeing told him something different from the second, and he took careful stock of that difference before he sent 3 lines back that said that sometimes doing one right thing properly could give 10 bad things less breath. Oberyn came home slower, because the wound under his ribs had begun to misbehave and because he enjoyed the attention of men who looked at him as if he were a play that had given them their money's worth and more. In the West, reaction came in the form of conversation rather than steel. Kevin looked down at the line of the Mander drawn on a map and held his finger above it as if measuring depth with fresh air. "We will not go to war for Gregor Clegane," he said. "We will also not let men think they can take our banners and pluck them when they wish and we not mind. We will demonstrate a care for our own dignity. We will not overindulge it. There is a balance in it." Cersei did not argue. She bided. That was her new art. The keeping of her teeth behind her smile. There came a season when couriers wore the skin off their horses' legs, and the red keep steps grew polished under boot and slipper. The marriage that had not been asked of Robert was asked of his brother, and Renly went to Highgarden with a retinue that glittered despite his protest, because glitter pleases Mace Tyrell and smoothing mace makes the rest of Highgarden workable. Renly rode under banners embroidered to an inch of their thread's life and strolled through gardens where the rain had not come on schedule but nevertheless made roses that looked like fat gossiping women and bees that took their trade more seriously. Olenna Tyrell poured him wine and put questions into it with a generosity that would have fed a regiment. She delighted in watching him drink and answer them. Marjorie sat with her hands folded and her eyes bright and asked 2 questions that mattered. "What do you want, truly, and what frightens you, honestly, and save the rest for later?" Renly liked that. He liked being liked openly instead of privately. He liked being told he was handsome without it sounding like a ledge being offered to stand on. He did not let any of this make him foolish. He negotiated. He laughed. He looked at Marjorie's hands and thought they did not tremble when she poured tea into cups that had been made to tremble in, fragile and designed as a test of a lady. He took that fact to bed with him and did not make more of it than exactly what it was. When the betrothal was announced, Robert was drunk enough to be happy and sober enough to be mean. "You are a prick with a flower stuck on it," he told his brother without heat. "Make a garden of her if you can." "She will make a garden of me," Renly said, cheerful and true. "That is also a kind of use," Robert allowed and embraced him, and bellowed for wine as if the order could drown the odd little stab in his chest that came when he noticed that there are kinds of contentment he would never have. Ned took the news north, and later, when he told Catelyn, she said, "The Reach and the Stormlands will be a stubborn braid," in a tone that held both calculation and something gentler. "It will keep bread in the city. It will give House Tyrell 2 places to stand," Ned said. "The Tyrells like to spread themselves in rooms with good light." "The Tyrells like to spread themselves?" Catelyn said, dry, and then she put her hand on his and squeezed it because she knew that he was thinking of multiple roads leading from this same point and could not be in 2 places at once. She had not learned to be in two places at once either, though she had often wanted to. She had learned something near enough to it, to hold one place in her mind steady while her body held another. Winter erected its scaffolding and began to build. The roads went sticky with cold that never quite turned hard. People learned to carry an extra piece of bread because sometimes the ovens did not warm when they must. In the Vale, Lisa kept herself busy with her son's breathing and the schedule of his bowels and the way he counted steps and whether the steps were even. John Aaron put his hand over hers at night and did not know how to tell her that the realm had 1,000 such details and most would be left to take care of themselves or not, because this was a kingdom and not a house. To comfort her, he made plans for the boys' fostering, because fostering can make boys into men when their homes have not warned them enough about how rough the world will be. He chose Dragonstone for the discipline and Stannis for the duty. He did not ask himself whether he was making a mistake. A man cannot ask that question with any real frequency and keep acting. He wrote the letter and sealed it. He showed it to Lisa because he loved her and because it did not occur to him not to. She read the words and smiled and told him that his handwriting was handsomer than it used to be and lay in bed staring at the ceiling while her husband slept beside her and the air in her chest grew tight and a spark inside her flared, small and very steady. She thought of the man who had once told her that she did not have to do what other people had told her was necessary. He had told her with a hand on hers, thumb just brushing the soft as if by accident. She had believed him not because she trusted him but because she did not trust anyone else. She sent for a small bottle. Peter Baelish came as he always did, on business. He came dripping charm and remarks about snows in the Vale that made you feel there was no other snow in the world that could be so much itself, so much the platonic idea of snow. He came with a way of looking at Lisa that made her believe she was a letter he had been reading a long time and only now understood. He came with a little vial that he set on the table with an unimportance that made it glow. "For my nerves," she said, not looking at him, and he said, "For your nerves." And that gave the rest of the conversation a correctness. Sometimes naming does that. "I do not like Dragonstone," she told him. "It is a place where laughter goes to hide. The boy will die there." "The boy will live," Peter said smoothly. "He will learn to stand while he does it. He will learn to be held. That is what Stannis does, he holds. It is not always comfortable." He let his mouth lower in the way he had taught it to when he wanted to look honest. He let her see the manipulation and be grateful for it because it made him seem less a trickster and more a man doing his best to be plain. "John Aaron loves your son. He is doing what men do when they think they love. He is moving the furniture without asking anyone whether the room wanted to be changed." Lisa twisted her fingers together. "I could give him another son," she said, and the way her voice broke would have broken a man who had not taught himself long ago that certain kinds of brokenness are not his to mend. Peter did not touch her. He had learned better. He did not need to. "You could," he said. And the king could take a wife who would sit on his chair without blaming it for its jaggedness. And the sea could stop wanting to eat the land. And men could be satisfied with one victory. "We will take the world as we find it." He set a finger to the vial and spun it, so it made a small circle on the polished table. "This is how certain ladies make their monthly pains less." "I have no monthly pains," Lisa said, without meaning to be funny. "Then toss it away," Peter said. "Or keep it in your drawer and use it to scent your handkerchiefs. It smells like almonds if you are in the right mood." He smiled then, and it was a smile that had knocked lesser women back on their heels. Lisa steadied herself and managed not to lean. It would be months before the vial found its occasion. In those months other things grew like mold in corners men did not think to look at. Varys received a letter from across the narrow sea written in a hand he had never known he would hold again. Illyrio Mopatis invited him, in a friendly, merchant's vagueness, to send news of the weather in King's Landing. Because rains here have been favorable for carpets and other soft things. Varys folded the letter between the fingers of his quietest mind and said, aloud to no one, "He has them," and felt three conflicting pleasures settle inside him like birds on different branches of the same tree. Viserys Targaryen left Braavos with his sister and went to Pentos. He went because men in Braavos had grown tired of being told they did not know their own business by a boy with pale hair and a grievance. He went because Willem Darry was dead and would not rise and compose more tender letters for men to read and then sigh or smirk at. He went because winter was coming and because Illyrio had fat, warm rooms and compliments Illyrio thought were thoughts. The girl went with him because she had never been asked to go or stay in her life, and the one time she had been asked to choose between two dresses, both of which itched. She had learned that choices can be a cruelty when they aren't a gift. The house in Pentos had a door painted red that did not belong to her but would be hers in memory forever because your mind loves what it thinks has saved it. Illyrio showed her silks he had brought out of a chest before breakfast to let them drowse in the light and told her they suited her. He told Viserys he had known kings who smelled worse and had better table manners, a joke which Viserys did not take as a joke. He introduced to them a knight who looked like a bear pushed through a gate and forced into a suit that pinched his shoulders, Jorah Mormont of Bear Island, a man who had been brought low by love and then by law. Jorah watched the girl as her brother talked and thought, uncomfortably, of cubs. Illyrio watched Jorah watch the girl and knew a kind of ledger being written before his eyes. "Would you give your sword to a prince?" Illyrio asked idly, tasting a fig. "I would give it to anyone who could keep hold of it," Jorah said, and Illyrio laughed as if he had been funny on purpose. They strapped the city to their backs and carried it across courtyards with cool stone and into rooms where men pretended time did not exist. There were carpets with patterns so intricate you could get lost before you reached the border. There were songs sung in a dozen tongues saying that there are other ways to be a king than to sit a spiky chair. There was bread with cardamom in it, and the girl remembered years later the smell of that bread more than she remembered the faces of men who told her they would see her sit above the world again. The red door shut at night and she slept, and sometimes in sleep she didn't hear her brother whispering angrily through his teeth in another room. She kept her strength where little girls keep strength, in her back and her stubbornness, between the bones. In King's Landing, Gendry burned his knuckles on a rivet and did not tell anyone so that no one would tell him to be more careful. Tobo Mott made him draw and draw again, and learned to trust a blade to tell him when it had had enough of the hammer and the stone and wanted the quench. In Storm's End, Edric climbed stairs until his breath went sweet with the ache, and the nurse who loved him called him her little lord and then her little king and then, catching herself, her little rowan tree, because rowans are sturdy and have berries, and a boy likes to be told he will feed birds who come all the way across the cold to find him. At Dragonstone, Shireen learned her letters with a care that would have wrung tears from a man made of softer stuff than Stannis. Her father nodded and made no speech. Celis talked to a red priest traveling under a poor violet cloak, and stood very still when he said fire has truth in it, and then stood very still and thought that she had heard truth but not the one the priest thought he had told. When she mentioned the priest to Stannis, he said, "Priests like to be important." And that was that. It would not always be that. Cersei came once more to court and stood with her head high during a feast where the boar had been roasted a touch too long and the salt on the skin had not melted as it should. She wore a gown green as the ocean when storms are thinking about it and a necklace that made men dizzy. She sat close enough to listen and far enough not to be leaned upon. She spoke to Littlefinger and did not laugh at him, and later, in her chamber, allowed herself to laugh, but softly, because she preferred to keep her laughter for when it would do some good. In a narrower room, Tyrion found Varys an agreeable companion, and then discovered that agreeable companions frighten him more than enemies. He cannot stop talking when silence opens near him. He learned that Varys could make him popular or forgettable simply by adjusting the tilt of his head. He disliked it. He used it. He wrote a letter to Jaime, and this time he did send it. It said, "You are making yourself into something. I am not sure what it is. Do not let it be something that will only ever be admired when it is dead." Jaime read it and chose to read admiration into it, the way a thirsty man can drink insults if they are cold. He did not show it to Cersei. Winter settled properly at last. Men rubbed their hands together and talked about spring as if their speech could convince it. Jon Arryn cracked his knuckles over a ledger and told Littlefinger to explain once more how it was that the harbor could seem to produce coin without men feeling they had had coin taken from them. Littlefinger did, with patience, and then he told a story about fish that made Jon smile despite himself. Later he watched Jon marry numbers to the realm and felt a small tickle of discomfort in his chest. He had always liked asking questions. He did not always like men who had gotten better at answering them. He wrote 2 letters, to a shipmaster with honest eyes, to a factor with dishonest ones, and thought that between them something would be loosened. In the Vale, the vial sat in a drawer scented with dried lavender and kept company with ribbons and 2 letters from a girlhood that had not turned out as its owner had expected. Lisa lifted it once, sniffed it, thought of almonds, laughed at herself and put it away. When she found it in her hand again on a day when John had said the boy would depart at the turn of the year because weather and a ship and Stannis's need all agreed, she did not remember how it had come there. She put it down. She picked it up. She set it behind a little stone dog with a chisel-scratched tongue. Robert Baratheon went to the yard and swung his hammer until he could be quiet and then sat with Ned and said, "Do you think I will be better when I am old?" And Ned said, "No." And they both laughed because it had been so long since anyone had told the king no that they found it a kind of medicine. Robert drank wine and wrestled with his brothers and kissed a singer's mouth who had missed a note and did not mind and tried to sleep without dreaming of men falling and of Tywin's skull. He observed that the dreams came less often now and that when they did they had changed. Sometimes a girl with dark hair walked through them, and in those dreams he did not feel like hitting anyone. He did not tell Ned about those. Some names a man does not speak to even his oldest friend. On a morning rhymed with frost, with fog making beards look like old moss, a rider from Gulltown came up the hill with a look like a kettle about to boil, and was put inside a room with John Arryn at one end and a table between and a window that gave them a stingy square of pale light. The rider's gloves stuck when he pulled them off. He put a letter down with hands unsteady from cold and fear and too much importance all at once. John broke the seal and read again and set the paper down without betraying anything but the simple fact that he had aging bones. He sent for Robert. The king came. Ned came. Varys drifted. Littlefinger smiled at the paper and at the men and told himself 4 possible reasons for the way John's jaw had set. The letter said that Lisa Arryn had taken to her bed with a case of the shakes and after calm had come, and the boy had been ill and had a fever that made him see crows in corners. But both were improving, and that Maester Coleman was anxious to assure them that visiting Dragonstone in deep winter could be delayed to spring. It was the sort of letter that exists to smuggle one small fact in as a passenger under the other news. That Lisa was not in her right mind and would be less so under the pressure of separation. John closed his eyes and knew that he would send the boy anyway. He loved Lisa. He knew what love does when it is allowed to choose long-term harm to avoid short-term pain. He had sworn vows to a realm. Those vows had taught him how to be the kind of man who refused to let love ruin a boy's caliber. It would ruin his marriage. He decided to be what he had decided to be long ago. Knowing this did not make the outcome less lonely. "Will you go?" Robert asked Ned afterward in the brief air between conference and consequence. "When the moment comes. If he falls? If I need a hand I can bear to hold in public without wanting to tear it off in private." Ned looked at the floor and the iron chair and the man he had fetched like a big dog at the end of a rope from one battlefield after another and brought home safe. "I will come if you call," he said. Robert put his hand on Ned's neck as if feeling the tendon there for tightness. "If I do not call?" "You will," Ned said. "You will." Outside, the frost let go and water ran along the seams in the stone. A boy in the yard dropped a practice sword and yelped when it hit his toe. A woman on the street of Flower laughed and threw a pinch of spice in a loaf where it would do extra good. Davos Seaworth looked out across a slate sea and decided he would teach his boy Mathos to reckon by the stars on nights when the cloud cover waited to pounce until you were 3 leagues out. Jorah Mormont in Pentos offered his good sense opinion for coin and watched a little girl learn to blink when men said her name as if they owned it and to hold the flinch inside instead of on her face. Cersei in Casterly Rock stood before her window and let the sea wind lick her hair and thought of a throne made of edges and of a man who had put his back to it and refused to sit until it allowed itself to be sat. She thought she would step into that room again and move a piece 1 square at a time instead of sweeping the board clear with an arm. Prince Oberyn in Sunspear had his wound picked clean with a needle by a woman who told him to say mercy when it hurt. He said Elia instead and did not apologize for the substitution. On a certain afternoon when the air had gone flat and the light had gone thin and the day seemed unsure whether it wanted to be anything at all, Lisa Arryn stood in her chamber and took out the vial and held it to her nose and thought, almonds, and then thought, nonsense, and then unscrewed the top and poured a drop into her palm and rubbed it between thumb and forefinger as if trying perfume. It made her skin smell like sweet wood. She laughed, and then she cried, and then she did not weep at all. She set the vial down and drank wine and walked to the window and told herself aloud that she was doing a brave thing for her son. She did not put anything in anyone's cup. Not that day. She put the vial back in the drawer and shut it and sat and folded her hands and made a plan that sounded, in her ears, like weeping turned into words. The sun went down. In the Red Keep, torches flared and guttered and steadied. Jaime Lannister took a walk that led him along the wall past a gap where stone had been replaced with new work that did not yet dare to crack. He paused and looked out and watched the river blacken and thought, fiercely and without quite knowing why, that he wanted to live long enough to learn how to be old and not ridiculous. Barristan Selmy lit a candle and prayed to the warrior as if the figure were an old friend he could borrow money from for one more day. Robert stared at his hands and tried to decide whether the tremor he sometimes felt was wine or regret or the simple fact of blood moving through a man's body. Ned Stark wrote his wife's name and his children's names and the name of a boy who had no true name but the one he had given him, and put the quill down and went to stand at the window and felt the day end against his chest like a weight. He did not mind the weight. He knew he would have minded waking without it. Beyond the narrow sea, in a room with walls fat with rugs and a ceiling that collected the day's heat for the night to dream with, a man with a long braid and a face like weather stood looking at a girl with hair like spilled milk and decided he would take her for his. Illyrio smiled and thought of numbers. Viserys smiled and thought of crowns. The girl did not smile. She put her hand on the place the red door would be if she closed her eyes. She found it, as she always did, and did not move her hand away until she had convinced herself she had done so of her own accord. In such ways, with such noises and silences, with such small cruelties and larger mercies, the realm moved a little closer to a day it did not yet know would demand from it the best and worst it could offer. Men slept as men sleep when they have done their work and it is not yet time to begin the next piece of it. Women slept as women sleep when they must get up first, and the day will be theirs to command only in as much as they can persuade it to accept their orders. The cold went on its business with no malice. The sea thought about nothing and decided to keep singing. The Iron Throne cooled, warmed, cooled again, and waited. It had nothing else to do. It had all the time in the world.